My son called me. He said, "Dad, we moved to another state last week. We just forgot to tell you." I stayed silent for a few seconds. Then I said, "All right, son. Good luck." I hung up, opened my laptop, and sent an email to my attorney with a very important attachment. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a family who underestimated your worth. My name is Nathan and I am 68 years old. I was standing in my home office looking out at the Georgia pines when my phone rang. It was my son Jared. I answered expecting the usual brief check-in or a veiled request for money to cover a luxury expense his wife Allison suddenly deemed essential. Instead, his voice came through the speaker with an absolute chilling coldness. He told me they had relocated to Texas. He said they moved last week and simply forgot to mention it to me. He then paused, waiting for my reaction, but the silence stretched between us. He quickly filled that silence by casually reminding me to ensure my monthly financial transfer to their joint account cleared by Friday. He needed the funds to secure their new lease. There was no apology for the secrecy. There was no warmth. There was only the expectation of my continued financial obedience. I absorbed the ultimate disrespect from the boy I had raised with every ounce of my energy. I did not argue. I did not yell or demand an explanation for why I was being discarded like an obsolete piece of machinery. I simply said, "All right, son, good luck." I tapped the screen and disconnected the call. The silence in my office was deafening. My own flesh and blood had reduced me to a silent benefactor useful only for the digits in my bank account. I did not sit down to mourn. I walked straight to my heavy mahogany desk and opened my secure laptop. I logged directly into my encrypted corporate banking portal. My hands moved over the keyboard with the precise muscle memory of a man who spent decades managing every single penny. I built my freight logistics empire from absolute nothing. In 1985, I bought a single-used diesel truck. I hauled heavy loads across state lines through blinding blizzards and scorching heat waves. I slept in the cab of that truck to save money for Jared's future. I grew that single rig into a massive fleet of 200 transport vehicles. You do not survive 40 years in the brutal logistics industry without learning how to spot a leak in your own ship. I navigated past my personal accounts and opened the primary operational ledger for the holding trust. The red numbers glared back at me from the bright screen. There was a massive unauthorized wire transfer listed in the pending column. Someone had initiated a devastating pull of funds directly from the core business reserves. This was not a minor withdrawal for a luxury car payment or a lavish vacation. This was a calculated strike aimed straight at the heart of my financial infrastructure. I recognized the theft instantly. The destination routing number matched an out-of-state bank located in Texas. They had not just abandoned me. They were attempting to gut my life's work on their way out the door. The sheer scale of the betrayal crystallized in my mind. They believed my age made me blind to their actions. They believed the old man was too slow to catch a digital heist. I picked up my cell phone and immediately dialed Bradley. He has been my lead corporate attorney and trusted confidant for over 20 years. He answered on the first ring, recognizing the specific tone of my private business line. I did not waste time with pleasantries. I gave him a direct, undeniable order. I commanded him to execute a total and immediate freeze on every single asset held within the family trust. I instructed him to lock down the primary accounts, the secondary emergency funds, and the real estate escrow files. Bradley heard the absolute concrete resolve in my voice and did not question the directive. I stayed on the line listening to the rapid clicking of his keyboard as he bypassed standard protocols to access the highest level of our security framework. He ran a rapid forensic audit while holding the phone to his ear. I explained the situation regarding Jared and Allison. I told him about the sudden move to Texas and the pending withdrawal I had just discovered on my terminal. Bradley muttered a sharp curse under his breath as the internal banking data populated on his end. The sound of his typing grew frantic. He pulled the digital authorization logs and traced the origin of the transfer request. The reality of the situation was becoming overwhelmingly clear. My son had utilized his secondary legacy clearance to bypass the standard authentication. He had weaponized the trust I freely gave him to bypass our standard fraud prevention measures. I paced the length of my office, feeling the cold anger replacing any lingering sorrow. I demanded Bradley verify the exact status of the outgoing funds. Every second mattered in preventing the complete financial drain of my commercial accounts. Bradley stopped typing. His breathing grew heavy through the receiver. He confirmed the horrifying truth with a steady, grim voice. Jared and Allison did not just move away to start a new life. They attempted to drain the primary operational account of exactly $400,000. The sheer audacity of the number hit me like a physical blow. That account held the payroll for my drivers and the fuel budget for my entire regional fleet. Stealing that specific money was designed to completely paralyze my logistics company. Bradley continued reading the terrifying details from the banking server. The transfer was not just initiated, it was currently processed through the automated federal clearing system. Bradley looked at the digital timestamp and delivered the escalating threat. He told me the massive wire transfer would clear the final security checkpoint and deposit into Jared's hidden Texas account in exactly 1 hour. We had 60 minutes before $400,000 vanished across state lines forever. If that money cleared, recovering it across jurisdictions would drag through the civil courts for years. Jared knew the legal loopholes. Allison had clearly coached him on how to exploit the banking timeline. I realized I could not handle this over the phone with Bradley. I told my attorney to prepare the emergency injunction documents. I hung up the phone, grabbed my keys off the desk, and sprinted out of my home office. I ignored the lingering pain in my knees, a souvenir from decades of shifting heavy freight. The clock was aggressively ticking down. I walked out the front door, the harsh afternoon sun hitting my face. I had exactly 1 hour to stop my own flesh and blood from financially executing me. I fired up the roaring engine of my heavy-duty truck and tore out of the driveway, leaving a cloud of dust behind me. The thick tires gripped the asphalt as I pushed the massive vehicle toward the city center. The digital dashboard clock mocked me with every single passing second. I had less than 50 minutes to stop $400,000 of my absolute blood and sweat from disappearing into an untouchable void in Texas. My grip on the steering wheel tightened until my knuckles ached with the strain. I navigated the heavy afternoon traffic with the aggressive precision I had learned driving 18-wheelers through the treacherous ice storms of the late 1980s. Back in those days, I fought black ice, mechanical failures, and sheer physical exhaustion just to put food on the table for a boy who now actively sought to ruin me. I pulled into the crowded parking lot of the central banking branch and left the truck parked recklessly across 2 spaces near the front entrance. I ignored the glaring security guard marching right past him and strode through the heavy double-glass doors. The chilled, air-conditioned lobby felt entirely detached from the burning urgency exploding in my chest. A long line of customers waited patiently at the teller stations, murmuring quietly. I completely ignored the line and the velvet ropes meant to guide the public. I walked straight past the front reception desks and headed directly down the restricted executive corridor. A junior assistant jumped up from her chair and tried to step in front of me, holding up her hands in protest. I sidestepped her without breaking my stride or offering a single word of explanation. I reached the heavy oak door belonging to the senior branch manager and pushed it wide open without knocking. The manager looked up from his dual computer monitors with a startled, confused expression. The manager immediately stood up from his chair and demanded to know why I was barging into his private secure office. I planted my hands flat on his polished mahogany desk and ordered him to cancel the pending wire transfer initiated from my corporate operational account. He adjusted his expensive silk tie and adopted a patronizing tone clearly intended to calm down an irrational old man. He pulled up my account on his bright screen, scanning the transaction details before flatly refusing my demand. He stated firmly that the transfer was perfectly legal because my son held secondary signatory rights on all legacy accounts within the trust. He spoke using a slow and overly enunciated voice, as if my 70 years of age had suddenly stripped me of basic cognitive comprehension. He condescendingly suggested I go home, drink some water, and rest, while he called my son to sort out what he termed a simple internal family miscommunication. He explicitly told me that strict bank policy prevented him from halting a fully authorized transaction just because an elderly account holder felt a sudden wave of unwarranted confusion. He reached his hand toward his desk phone, explicitly threatening to call building security to have me physically escorted from the premises. The sheer blind arrogance of his dismissal clarified everything about the situation. He saw nothing but a fragile old man who had lost his grip on modern reality. He completely failed to see the original architect of the very commercial accounts that kept his entire regional branch profitable. He underestimated the man standing in front of him. I reached inside the inner pocket of my heavy leather jacket and pulled out a thick, sealed envelope containing the original unredacted incorporation documents of my logistics firm. I slammed the heavy stack of legal papers directly over his computer keyboard, startling him. I did not raise my voice or show a single ounce of panic. I leaned in close until we were practically face to face and instructed him to read page 34, paragraph 7. He hesitated for a second before flipping nervously through the rigid parchment pages. His eyes scanned the dense legal text and all the color rapidly drained from his arrogant face. The specific protective clause I had drafted 3 decades ago alongside my legal team was entirely bulletproof. It explicitly stated that while secondary signatories could theoretically initiate transfers, the primary founder retained an absolute irrevocable veto power over any financial transaction exceeding $10,000 without prior written consent. I informed him with cold precision that if that wire cleared, I would personally hold his branch liable for the full stolen amount and unleash my entire legal team to systematically dismantle his career. The patronizing smirk vanished instantly, replaced by sheer professional terror. He looked at the digital clock on his office wall. We had exactly 4 minutes remaining before the federal clearing window permanently closed. His fingers flew across his keyboard in a frantic, desperate panic. He bypassed the standard queuing protocols and hammered his high-level override credentials into the banking terminal. He hit the final execution key, and the screen flashed a bright green confirmation message. The transfer was officially and permanently terminated. The $400,000 locked safely back into my operational reserves. He slumped back in his leather chair, wiping a heavy bead of sweat from his forehead. Before the breathless manager could offer a stuttering apology, my cell phone erupted with a loud, aggressive ringtone piercing the silence of the office. The caller identification flashed brightly on the screen, displaying an unknown local number from Texas. I answered the call and pressed the cold phone to my ear. It was my daughter-in-law, Allison. The ambient noise of a high-end luxury environment echoed sharply behind her voice. She was not calling to check on my well-being or to offer any explanation for their sudden cowardly departure. She was screaming in a blind, uncontrolled rage that distorted her usually composed voice. She stood squarely in the middle of an exclusive European sports car dealership, demanding to know why her premium platinum card had just been utterly rejected. She had confidently handed the elite card to the sales manager to finalize the immediate purchase of a customized vehicle worth over $120,000. Instead of a smooth, prestigious transaction, the card terminal had loudly declined the payment in front of a dozen elite socialites and the entire suited sales staff. Her voice cracked with a vicious mixture of profound public embarrassment and furious unearned entitlement. She shrieked that I was purposely ruining her life and actively destroying her carefully constructed social standing in her brand new city. She commanded me to call the bank immediately and authorize the necessary funds, declaring that the money was rightfully theirs to establish their new wealthy status. The toxic vitriol pouring out of the phone speaker was suffocating, but it did not make me flinch or feel a single drop of guilt. The financial umbilical cord was now officially severed, and she was realizing it in the most public, humiliating way possible. The toxic vitriol pouring out of the phone speaker was suffocating. Allison did not even pause to take a single breath. She demanded to know what kind of senile malfunction caused me to lock the corporate accounts. Her shrill voice echoed through the bank lobby before I firmly stepped outside into the sweltering afternoon heat to take the brunt of her verbal abuse. She stood in the middle of a high-end European auto showroom in Texas, completely humiliated, and she wanted me to pay for it. She hurled ageist insults with terrifying speed, calling me a paranoid old fool who belonged in a nursing home. She sneered at my working-class background, stating that a man who spent half his life smelling like diesel fuel and cheap diner coffee had no business controlling millions of dollars. She insisted that Jared and she had finally achieved the elite social status they deserved. They absolutely needed that $120,000 sports car to impress the right investors in their new luxury zip code. She commanded me to march right back into the bank and reactivate her platinum card immediately. She framed my money as her divine right, viewing my decades of grinding labor as nothing more than a stepping stone for her unearned luxury. She actually threatened to cut me out of their lives completely if I did not instantly comply with her outrageous financial demands and restore her access to my business capital. I let her scream until her voice cracked. I did not interrupt her tirade. When she finally paused to gasp for air, I delivered my response with absolute icy precision. I told her to lower her voice when speaking to the man who owns the roof over her head. I reminded her exactly where that wealth originated. I did not inherit a single dime of my fortune. I hauled heavy commercial freight through blinding Midwestern blizzards for 20 brutal years to secure the empire she was currently attempting to drain. I spent countless nights sleeping behind the steering wheel of a freezing truck cab just to ensure my son would never know the sharp sting of true poverty. I sacrificed my youth, my joints, and my peace of mind to build a legacy of absolute security. I explicitly stated that I would never be commanded by an entitled woman who viewed my entire life's work as her own personal automated teller machine. I told her that she and Jared had made a catastrophic miscalculation by confusing my quiet generosity with senile weakness. She had never worked a hard day in her entire privileged life, and I refused to fund her ridiculous charade a single second longer. Allison attempted to scream over my words, launching into another frantic string of vicious threats and insults. I simply pulled the phone away from my ear and pressed the end call button. I cut the wireless connection permanently, severing her access to my finances and my energy. I immediately blocked her number, and then I blocked Jared's number. The sudden silence of the disconnected line felt like a massive physical weight lifting off my tired shoulders, bringing me a profound sense of clarity. I drove my heavy-duty truck back to my private estate, feeling a cold, unyielding resolve settling deep into my bones. The sprawling property usually brought me immense comfort, but today it felt like a compromised fortress. I pulled through the front gates and parked near the main entrance. I marched straight into my home office and initiated a total digital lockdown. I systematically changed every single personal and corporate password associated with my identity. I revoked all remote access privileges tied to any device previously used by Jared. I completely wiped the security clearance for his laptop and his mobile phone, ensuring he could not view a single decimal point of my commercial holdings. Once the digital perimeter was completely secured, I moved on to the physical house. I walked through the quiet hallways and manually disabled the electronic smart locks that Jared previously had full access to. I contacted a private corporate security firm and ordered an immediate total hardware replacement for every exterior door on the property. I reprogrammed the main master alarm system with a completely new complex numerical sequence known only to me. I gathered the spare house keys Jared had kept for supposed family emergencies and tossed them directly into the trash can. My son had just proven he was entirely willing to loot my operational business accounts while running off to Texas. I could not risk him returning in the dead of night to strip the house of its expensive physical valuables. I moved through the silent rooms with a strict tactical mindset, treating my own home as a highly sensitive operational zone. I absolutely refused to be a vulnerable victim in the very house I built from the ground up with my own 2 hands. I had just finished securing the back patio doors when a series of heavy, aggressive knocks echoed from the front entryway. I walked to the foyer and looked through the reinforced glass pane. A stern-looking man in a cheap suit stood on my porch, clutching a thick manila folder. I opened the door, demanding to know his business on my property. He asked to confirm my legal identity. When I stated my full name, he unceremoniously shoved the thick legal summons directly against my chest. He quickly declared that I was officially served and rapidly marched back to his unmarked vehicle. I stood in the doorway, staring down at the heavy document in my hands. The official county court seal stamped across the top page radiated an immediate sense of pure dread. I closed the front door, walked directly back to my study, and tore open the thick envelope. I scanned the dense legal text, my vision blurring with a terrifying combination of shock and absolute outrage. It was a formal legal petition for emergency medical guardianship. Jared had filed the devastating paperwork in the local county court right before cowardly fleeing the state. He was actively petitioning a local judge to strip me of all my fundamental legal rights. I read the fraudulent claims detailed in the filing. Jared and Allison had provided sworn affidavits falsely claiming that I suffered from severe rapid-onset violent dementia. They stated under penalty of perjury that I was a physical danger to myself and completely incapable of managing my own commercial logistics empire. They were demanding absolute control over my medical care, my personal freedom, and every single financial asset tied to my name. My own son was actively orchestrating a hostile legal kidnapping. I carried the thick legal document into my kitchen and spread the crisp pages across the cold granite counter. The words printed on the stark white paper outlined a coordinated, meticulous assassination of my personal freedom and dignity. Jared and Allison were not simply trying to steal my money anymore. They were actively petitioning the state to permanently erase me from society. The sworn affidavits claimed I was prone to violent, unpredictable outbursts and suffered from severe rapid-onset dementia. They painted a highly fabricated picture of a broken, hostile old man who could no longer recognize his own family or manage his daily routine. The petition specifically requested that I be forcefully remanded to a highly restrictive state-run psychiatric facility for my own supposed safety and protection. I knew exactly what happened to elderly African American men who were locked away in those types of underfunded, anonymous institutions. They were heavily medicated, ignored and left to fade away into absolute nothingness, while the state drained their assets to cover the exorbitant housing fees. But Jared did not want the state to take my assets. The final page of the petition demanded that Jared be granted absolute emergency financial control over my entire holding company. He wanted the master keys to the logistics empire I bled for. He wanted to sit in my leather chair, command my fleet of trucks, and liquidate the corporate accounts to fund his lavish new Texas lifestyle, while I rotted in a sterile locked ward. The sheer calculating evil required to draft this document was staggering. My son was using the legal system as a weapon of total destruction against his own father. I folded the documents and placed them back inside the heavy manila envelope. I absolutely refused to be a victim of a legalized kidnapping. I picked up my cell phone and bypassed my corporate lawyer, making a direct, untraceable call to a man named Dennis. Dennis was a highly ruthless former federal investigator who now operated exclusively in the private sector, handling high-stakes corporate espionage. We crossed paths 10 years ago when I needed a highly discreet professional to root out a sophisticated embezzlement ring operating within my primary shipping hub. He answered immediately, and I gave him a brief, unvarnished summary of the hostile guardianship petition. I told him I needed the absolute origin of the medical evaluation completely dismantled before the sun came up. Dennis arrived at my front gate less than 40 minutes later, driving an unmarked vehicle and carrying a heavy, reinforced Pelican case. He did not offer any pointless sympathy or waste time with basic pleasantries. He walked straight into my dining room, opened his case, and booted up a heavily encrypted field laptop. I handed him the physical legal summons, highlighting the signature of the attending physician who had supposedly evaluated my mental decline. Dennis pulled a pair of reading glasses from his pocket and stared intensely at the signature block. He stated that no legitimate judge signs an emergency extraction order without a cooperating medical professional providing a sworn preliminary diagnosis. Someone with a valid medical license had knowingly put their entire career on the line to validate Jared's fraudulent claims. Dennis began running the physician's credentials through a series of restricted federal databases to find the weak link. The harsh blue light of the laptop screen illuminated the dark dining room as Dennis systematically bypassed the standard firewalls of the state medical registry. His fingers moved with lightning speed, cross-referencing the registration numbers printed beneath the sloppy signature on the court document. He successfully isolated the specific medical license and pulled the complete professional profile of the signatory. The screen is populated with the details of a licensed private practitioner operating a boutique concierge clinic on the affluent north side of the city. Dennis tapped the glass screen and pointed to the glaring discrepancy in the official medical logs. The doctor claimed in his sworn affidavit that he had conducted a comprehensive 3-hour psychological evaluation of me inside my own home just 2 days prior. I had not allowed a single visitor onto my property in over a week. I spent that entire afternoon negotiating regional shipping routes with my fleet managers over the phone. Furthermore, the high-definition security cameras I had recently installed verified that no medical professional had ever approached my front gates. The entire medical evaluation was a complete criminal fabrication. This doctor had literally invented a severe psychiatric condition out of thin air to supply Jared with the necessary ammunition for a hostile legal takeover. Dennis pulled up the clinic's financial records and began cross-checking them against the recent activity on Jared's frozen operational accounts. He let out a low, sharp whistle as a massive red flag appeared on the screen. The connection between my son and this corrupt physician was not random. It was a highly calculated, illegal business transaction. Dennis hit a few more keys, pulling up the doctor's personal background, an extended family tree to verify the ultimate source of the betrayal. The high-resolution photograph of the physician appeared on the monitor alongside his full legal name. It was Dr. Evans. He was Allison's maternal uncle. The exact same man who had confidently toasted to my health at their wedding reception was now actively orchestrating my permanent incarceration. Allison had leveraged her own flesh and blood to supply the fraudulent medical documentation required to steal my life savings and completely erase me from society. Dennis did not stop digging. He accessed the secured county court docket to track the exact real-time status of the medical petition. He hit the refresh button and a new highly alarming document materialized on the center of the screen. The blood drained from my face as I read the freshly uploaded court order. Dr. Evans had not just submitted a passive medical evaluation. He had escalated the situation to a critical life-threatening level. He was actively petitioning the on-call Superior Court judge for an immediate involuntary psychiatric hold. The legal document specifically requested that heavily armed local law enforcement officers be dispatched to my address to forcefully extract me from my personal property. The petition falsely claimed I was actively barricading myself inside with weapons and posed a severe immediate physical threat to the surrounding neighborhood. The judge was scheduled to review and sign the violent extraction order first thing in the morning. I looked at the digital clock on the bottom of the computer screen. We had exactly 14 hours before a heavily militarized police unit kicked down my newly reinforced front door and dragged me away in medical restraints. My daughter-in-law and her corrupt uncle were turning my own home into an inescapable trap. We had to strike back before the sun rose and the courts opened. The hum of the fluorescent lights overhead echoes against the damp concrete walls as we close the distance. Dr. Evans stops dead in his tracks, his hand freezing on the handle of his pristine luxury vehicle. When he turns, his eyes narrow with an engineered malice that matches Allison's perfectly. He does not see an adversary, he sees a vulnerable old man. He can easily dominate with clinical jargon. He barks out a cruel laugh, telling me that stepping foot on his private clinic property simply proves my complete lack of mental stability. He loudly threatens to call the municipal police department to report a highly unhinged patient who escaped his medical supervision. He reaches into his tailored jacket pocket for his personal phone, declaring that the violent dementia outlined in Jared's petition is actively manifesting right in front of his eyes. He attempts to wave his heavy leather briefcase to force us to back away, shouting that our presence constitutes illegal stalking and corporate harassment. He commands Dennis to move away or face immediate felony charges for obstructing a medical officer. His clinical mask remains firmly glued to his face, his chest swelling with the supreme arrogance of a man who believes his medical credentials make him completely untouchable by ordinary citizens. He looks at me with pure disgust, demanding I turn around and wait for the official court-ordered transportation team to retrieve me properly. He boasts that his medical signature holds absolute authority in the eyes of the local probate courts, and that a man of my advanced age has no standing to question his official psychiatric diagnosis. I stand perfectly still, refusing to let his calculated hostility crack my emotional resolve. My decades of dealing with deceptive corporate sharks have trained me to recognize the exact moment a predator realizes he is actually the prey. I look at Dennis, who steps smoothly into the light of the overhead garage fixtures. Dennis unzips his tactical folder and reveals a series of high-resolution printouts and bank ledger sheets directly over the hood of Evan's car. The undeniable evidence glares back at the trembling physician. Dennis points directly to a series of highly sophisticated offshore wire transfers, originating from a dummy corporation Jared set up in the Cayman Islands. The transaction sheets show an exact transfer of $75,000, processed directly into Dr. Evans' private Swiss brokerage account. The timestamp on the electronic deposit exactly matches the date on the fraudulent preliminary psychiatric evaluation. Dennis also flashes clear surveillance photographs of Jared handing a physical folder of medical records to Evans at an upscale country club restaurant 3 weeks ago. There is no ambiguous gray area remaining. The paper trail systematically maps a textbook case of medical fraud, commercial bribery, and federal conspiracy to manipulate a state court. The physician stares at the financial ledger sheets, his breathing suddenly turning shallow as his clinical authority evaporates into the damp air. He tries to speak, but his jaw locks up completely, his eyes darting frantically across the detailed digital footprints Dennis has laid out on the metal surface. He realizes his flawless hidden transaction is entirely exposed. The overwhelming reality of absolute professional ruin settles heavily on Dr. Evans' shoulders. The supreme clinical arrogance that fueled his threats completely shatters, leaving a panicked, trembling man in its place. Dennis explains with absolute coldness that these specific financial documents are already prepared for immediate transmission to the State Medical Board, the Internal Revenue Service, and the Federal Bureau of Investigation. A conviction for interstate wire fraud and medical conspiracy carries a mandatory minimum sentence of 15 years in a federal penitentiary alongside the immediate permanent revocation of his license to practice medicine. Evans drops his leather briefcase to the grease-stained concrete floor, his hands shaking so violently he can barely grasp the edge of his car door. He looks at me, his voice cracking, as he begs me not to destroy his entire livelihood over a family dispute. He claims Jared forced his hand, promising him a lucrative share of the logistics company once the guardianship cleared the probate court. I do not offer him a single drop of mercy or engage in any emotional discussion. Dennis pulls a pre-drafted legal affidavit from his tactical folder and slams a heavy black pen into the doctor's trembling hand. He commands the physician to sign the document immediately. Faced with the immediate prospect of a federal cell, Evans leans over the hood of his luxury sedan and signs the paperwork. His signature officially and permanently revokes the emergency medical petition, admitting under penalty of perjury that the entire psychiatric evaluation was an engineered bribe. He stamps his official notary seal onto the document, completing his total legal surrender right there in the dark. Dr. Evans hands the signed revocation back to Dennis, his face completely hollowed out by fear and exhaustion. But as he straightens his posture, a twisted, dark grin slowly deforms his lips, and he lets out a bitter, mocking laugh that echoes sharply against the concrete pillars. He looks at me with a sickening glint of malicious satisfaction, telling me that my hard-won legal victory is entirely pointless. He informs me that I am completely too late to protect the core assets of my logistics empire. He uncovers a horrifying detail that Jared did not wait for the final guardianship hearing to execute his final strike. Jared had already weaponized the certified copy of the preliminary medical evaluation the very hour it was signed. My son used that temporary fraudulent authority to misrepresent himself as my legal custodian to a high-risk predatory lending syndicate. He utilized that false power of attorney to sign a massive 7-figure commercial lien against my primary logistics warehouse. That specific warehouse serves as the central hub for my entire freight operation, housing all my active loading docks, communication servers, and distribution grids. Evans sneers that the syndicate does not care about affidavits or family retributions. They care only about immediate financial collection, and they now possess a valid legal claim to physically seize and chain shut my entire commercial property. He tells me that while I was busy hunting him down, Jared was successfully locking an inescapable financial noose around my company. The sound of his bitter laughter trails off as Dennis quickly secures the signed affidavit. A brand new devastating conflict has emerged, and the clock is running out on my business survival. The victory here is instantly eclipsed by a massive threat to the warehouse. I left the suffocating dampness of the clinic parking garage and drove my heavy-duty truck toward the industrial sector with terrifying speed. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned entirely white. Dr. Evans had signed his own professional death warrant, but his final mocking revelation burned a hole directly through my chest. Jared had already weaponized the fraudulent guardianship paperwork to strike at the physical heart of my logistics empire. I navigated the familiar commercial routes, ignoring the speed limits, pushing my engine to its absolute breaking point. As I approached my primary distribution hub, a wave of pure adrenaline flooded my veins. The sheer scale of the disruption was immediately visible from 3 blocks away. A massive line of idling 18-wheelers stretched down the main avenue, completely blocked from entering the loading zones. Dozens of my loyal drivers and warehouse technicians stood crowded on the sidewalks, looking bewildered and extremely angry. I slammed my truck into park near the main entrance and jumped out into the thick diesel exhaust. A team of 6 aggressive, heavily armed repo men dressed in unmarked tactical gear were physically seizing my property. They were aggressively shoving my shift managers away from the perimeter. 2 of the largest men were currently wrapping thick industrial steel chains around the main security gates and snapping heavy-duty padlocks into place. They were systematically locking my workers out of the very facility that fed their families. The sight of armed strangers commandeering the concrete yard I had built from absolutely nothing triggered a deeply protective fury inside me. I marched directly through the crowd of my workers, shoving past the heavy steel barricades to confront the armed invaders trespassing on my land. The leader of the repo crew noticed my approach and immediately stepped forward to block my path. He was a broad, intimidating man with a deeply scarred face and a hand resting casually on the heavy tactical belt around his waist. I demanded that he immediately remove the chains and order his men off my commercial property. He did not flinch or offer any professional courtesy. He simply sneered and violently shoved a heavy metal clipboard directly into my chest. He told me to read the attached court-certified document before I got myself arrested for trespassing on a surrendered asset. I grabbed the clipboard and scanned the dense legal text printed on the top page. The document was a massive, high-risk commercial lien filed against the exact deed of my logistics warehouse. Jared had actively utilized the forged medical power of attorney to completely bypass corporate security and pledge my primary real estate as collateral for an exorbitant short-term loan. My own son had borrowed $500,000 against my life's work and instantly defaulted on the repayment terms. The repo leader crossed his arms and arrogantly declared that the grace period expired at midnight. He stated that the property was now legally forfeit and ordered me to vacate the premises before he authorized his men to remove me by physical force. He looked at me with profound disrespect, dismissing me as a confused, ruined old man who had just lost his entire company to the bank. I stared directly into his eyes and told him he had made a catastrophic error by assuming the paperwork he held was legitimate. Before the repo leader could issue another violent threat, a chorus of blaring sirens shattered the tense atmosphere of the industrial yard. 3 municipal police cruisers aggressively jumped the curb and blocked the repo team's tactical vehicles. Bradley stepped out of the lead cruiser accompanied by the district police captain. My corporate attorney did not waste a single second. He marched directly up to the repo leader and snatched the fraudulent clipboard right out of his hands. Bradley presented the freshly notarized legal affidavit we had just extracted from Dr. Evans in the clinic parking garage. Bradley loudly and clearly explained to the police captain that the underlying power of attorney utilized to secure the massive commercial loan was obtained through documented medical fraud and federal conspiracy. He declared the commercial lien completely null and void effective immediately. The police captain read the undeniable confession from the licensed physician and instantly turned his authority against the armed invaders. The captain placed his hand on his service weapon and ordered the repo crew to stand down and unlock my gates immediately or face mass arrest for armed trespassing and commercial extortion. The repo leader realized his legal leverage had entirely evaporated in front of his eyes. He cursed loudly under his breath and aggressively signaled his men to retreat. The heavy steel chains crashed loudly onto the concrete driveway, restoring my absolute control over my facility. The repo men began throwing their heavy steel chains and shattered padlocks into the back of their tactical vehicles, preparing to evacuate the industrial yard. However, the scarred leader did not immediately get into the driver's seat of his truck. He walked slowly back over to where I stood next to Bradley on the cracked pavement. He looked at me with a deeply unsettling mixture of grim respect and chilling pity. He leaned in close, ensuring the municipal police captain could not hear his quiet, menacing words over the loud, idling engines of the freight trucks. He told me that obliterating the legal paper trail was a completely meaningless temporary victory. He explicitly revealed that Jared did not borrow that $500,000 from a traditional commercial bank or a registered corporate lender. My son had bypassed the legal banking system entirely to rapidly secure his massive escape funds. Jared had borrowed the money from a highly violent underground criminal syndicate operating out of the Southern District. The repo leader explained that his crew was merely the legitimate front for a deeply illegitimate and deadly organization. He warned me that the syndicate absolutely does not care about invalidated court orders, forged medical documents, or municipal police injunctions. They operate outside the law, and they only care about recovering their stolen cash with exorbitant interest. The leader stepped back toward his vehicle and delivered a horrifying final reality check. He stated that when Jared signed the fraudulent loan paperwork, he had cowardly listed my private residential estate as his primary contact address. The syndicate fully intended to collect their $500,000 tonight. They knew exactly where I lived, and they were already mobilizing. The immediate threat materialized long before the sun had fully set over my Georgia estate. I was standing in my study reviewing the revoked warehouse line when the deep rumble of high-performance engines vibrated through the floorboards. I walked to the reinforced front window and watched 2 heavy, unmarked black sport utility vehicles bypass my newly repaired driveway gates entirely by crushing straight through the decorative wrought iron fencing. They parked aggressively on the pristine front lawn, tearing deep, muddy trenches into the grass. 4 massive men stepped out of the vehicles, moving with a synchronized, predatory efficiency that immediately identified them as highly trained professional enforcers. They did not wear masks or bother hiding their faces. They wore dark, tailored suits that completely failed to conceal the heavy tactical weapons strapped beneath their jackets. The lead enforcer, a terrifyingly calm man with completely dead eyes, walked directly up my front steps and hammered his massive fist against the heavy mahogany door. I did not wait for him to break the glass. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door wide open, meeting his hostile stare with absolute silence. He did not introduce himself. He stated with a low, gravelly voice that my son Jared had borrowed $500,000 in untraceable cash from his dangerous employers. He explicitly declared that the grace period had expired yesterday, and he had arrived to collect the debt directly from the father. He demanded the $500,000 immediately, promising severe physical consequences if I refused to settle the outstanding criminal balance. The enforcer intentionally crowded my physical space, attempting to use his massive frame to intimidate me into immediate compliance. I did not show a single ounce of fear or take a single step backward. Decades ago, I built my logistics business in neighborhoods where violent men constantly tried to extort my drivers for protection money. I learned early that showing weakness to a predator guarantees you will be eaten alive. I looked the lead enforcer directly in the eyes, stepped aside, and calmly invited him into my home. The sheer, unexpected nature of my hospitality momentarily broke his aggressive momentum. He gestured for his 3 armed subordinates to remain on the ruined lawn and cautiously stepped inside my foyer. I led him directly into the kitchen without checking to see if he was following. I grabbed 2 ceramic mugs from the cabinet and poured us both hot black coffee from the carafe. I slid a steaming mug across the granite island toward him and leaned against the counter. I maintained absolute eye contact and explained the brutal reality of his current situation. I told him in a steady, unyielding voice that Jared was not a legitimate businessman capable of securing a $500,000 loan. I explicitly stated that my son was a desperate coward and a thief who had actively betrayed both of our organizations. I outlined exactly how Jared had forged my signature, attempted to drain my corporate accounts, and utilized a fake medical evaluation to pledge my commercial warehouse as collateral. I made it absolutely clear that Jared had scammed the syndicate using my sterling reputation as a shield, and I had already legally severed all financial ties with him. I informed the enforcer that looking for a massive payout in my house was a total waste of his time. The enforcer did not touch the hot coffee. He stared at me with calculating eyes, processing the absolute lack of deception in my voice. He slowly reached inside his tailored jacket and rested his hand on his concealed weapon, preparing to demand alternative compensation. Before he could escalate the threat, I reached into the deep pocket of my trousers and retrieved a thick, sealed manila folder. I had instructed Dennis to compile this specific intelligence the moment we discovered Jared's fraudulent Texas relocation. I slid the heavy folder across the granite island, pushing it directly against the enforcer's coffee mug. I calmly informed him that while I would not pay a single cent of my son's illegitimate criminal debts, I was more than willing to provide the exact location of the man who had actively stolen their money. The enforcer cautiously opened the flap and reviewed the highly detailed contents. The dossier contained everything a professional extraction team could possibly need. Dennis had acquired the exact physical address of the sprawling luxury mansion Jared and Allison were currently renting in a gated Texas community. The first page featured a high-resolution satellite map pinpointing the primary entryways and security camera blind spots around the perimeter. The second page contained the current digital gate codes required to bypass the neighborhood security checkpoint without triggering any silent alarms. The final section detailed Jared's predictable daily schedule, including his morning coffee runs, his afternoon meetings at his fraudulent real estate office, and the specific luxury vehicle he was currently driving. I watched the enforcer's eyes widen slightly as he absorbed the sheer tactical value of the intelligence. I was handing him a perfectly gift-wrapped blueprint to track down the man who had directly stolen from his criminal bosses. The syndicate enforcer silently closed the manila folder and tucked it securely inside his tailored jacket right next to his concealed firearm. He offered a slow, grim nod of professional understanding, completely accepting the intelligence as full payment for his immediate departure. He turned his back on me and walked directly out of my kitchen without uttering another threatening word. I stood by the window and watched the 4 armed men pile back into their sport utility vehicles. They threw their engines into reverse, tearing up more of my manicured lawn as they violently backed out of my property. The heavy black trucks sped down the darkened street, redirecting their entire focused wrath toward the state of Texas. I locked my front door and methodically cleaned the coffee mugs, feeling absolutely no remorse for putting a target squarely on my son's back. Jared had invited this extreme violence into our lives, and now he was going to face the brutal consequences of his own monumental greed. I finally went to bed, leaving my cell phone resting on the nightstand with the ringer volume turned to maximum. I knew exactly what was coming. At exactly 3 o'clock the next morning, the piercing sound of my ringtone shattered the total silence of my bedroom. The caller identification displayed Jared's personal number. I answered the call and pressed the receiver to my ear without saying a single word. My son was breathing heavily into the microphone, weeping in absolute sheer terror. His voice cracked as he whispered that he was hiding in his dark master closet. He frantically explained that 4 unidentified, heavily armed men had somehow bypassed the neighborhood security gate and were currently circling his luxury property, shining bright flashlights directly into his living room windows. I listened to the frantic hyperventilating coming through the phone speaker. Jared was sobbing uncontrollably. He babbled about the heavy tactical trucks parked illegally across his pristine manicured lawn. He described the blinding beams of tactical flashlights sweeping across his expansive living room windows, slicing through the darkness of his Texas mansion. The syndicate enforcers were not politely knocking on his front door. They were systematically establishing a physical perimeter around his property, trapping him inside. Jared begged me to open my encrypted banking portal immediately. He demanded I wire the $500,000 directly into his offshore account to satisfy the blood debt he owed the syndicate. His voice climbed an entire octave as he attempted to weaponize every single ounce of familial guilt he could muster. He cried out that I was his father and that a father is supposed to protect his only son from absolute physical destruction. He pleaded that they were going to break through the reinforced glass and drag him out into the street. He reminded me of his childhood, desperately trying to resurrect the image of a little boy who used to ride shotgun in my freight truck. He promised he would pay me back every single penny with interest. He swore he would dissolve the fraudulent real estate firm, drop the malicious medical guardianship petition, and return to Georgia to make everything right. He offered empty promises forged in the absolute heat of pure terror. He wept openly, begging me to save his life from the violent consequences of his own monumental greed. I let him cry. I let the silence stretch across the cellular connection while he listened to the heavy boots pacing outside his luxury home. I did not offer a single word of comfort. I spoke with a quiet, unyielding authority that cut straight through his hysterical weeping. I reminded my son of the harsh winter of 1987. The local Teamsters had organized a massive strike, completely shutting down the regional freight hubs. We had absolutely zero money in the bank, and the pantry was completely bare. I told Jared I made the conscious decision to cross a violent picket line to deliver a critical shipment of medical supplies just to put food on our kitchen table. I did not ask for a handout or expect someone else to save me. I stepped out of my truck cab and took a severe, brutal beating from 5 angry striking workers wielding heavy steel wrenches. I bled on the frozen asphalt for the exact wealth he was currently using to fund his pathetic luxury lifestyle. I explained to him that in the real world, every single action carries a direct physical consequence. He chose to bypass legitimate commercial banking and crawl into bed with violent underground criminals. He happily accepted their $500,000 to finance his great Texas escape. I told him he was currently experiencing the natural result of playing an adult game without possessing the necessary backbone to face the inevitable collection process. I informed him that the men circling his house were simply enforcing the contract he willingly signed. He wanted to play the role of a high-stakes corporate tycoon, and now the bill had officially arrived. I explicitly informed Jared that I would not authorize a single wire transfer. I would not send him $500,000. I would not send him a solitary dime. I told him he was no longer speaking to a loving father, but to a corporate executive evaluating a massive financial liability. He had filed fraudulent medical documents attempting to lock me in a psychiatric ward. He had placed an illegal commercial lien against my primary logistics warehouse. He had actively tried to destroy the very financial foundation he was now begging me to utilize to save his life. The sheer mathematical hypocrisy of his request was staggering. I officially severed the emotional bond that had blinded me for so many decades. I told him he was completely on his own to negotiate his survival with the syndicate boss. I suggested he go outside, face the men on his lawn, and offer them the keys to his imported sports cars and the deed to his rented mansion. I advised him to empty his pockets and pray the enforcers possessed a shred of mercy because my vault was permanently closed. The shock on the other end of the line was palpable. The weeping abruptly stopped, replaced by the hollow silence of a man realizing his ultimate safety net had just been completely vaporized. Jared stammered, unable to process the absolute finality of my rejection. He realized I was perfectly willing to let him face the brutal syndicate justice he had actively brought upon himself. He was no longer a son to me. He was a hostile entity that I had successfully neutralized and quarantined in another state. I listened to his frantic breathing, feeling an immense, profound peace wash over my mind. The decades of constant financial anxiety tied to his endless demands simply evaporated into the dark night. Before Jared could launch into another pathetic cycle of begging, a sharp, violent scuffle erupted on the other end of the connection. I heard the phone clatter against a hard surface before being snatched up aggressively. Allison came onto the line, her voice trembling with panic but dripping with a vicious, venomous hatred. She completely bypassed any attempt at emotional manipulation and immediately launched a catastrophic legal threat. She screamed that if I left them to die at the hands of the syndicate, she would ensure I lost everything I had ever built. She revealed she possessed a highly modified, falsified version of my internal corporate tax ledgers. She had spent the last several months secretly downloading my private financial data and actively altering the digital spreadsheets to reflect massive systemic tax evasion and illegal offshore money laundering. She shrieked that she was holding her finger directly over a send button. If I did not instantly wire the funds, she promised to anonymously submit the heavily doctored documents directly to the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division. She knew exactly how the federal bureaucracy operated. A formal submission of that magnitude would instantly trigger a massive federal audit. Armed federal agents would violently raid my corporate headquarters, seize my communication servers, and freeze my legitimate logistics operations for years. She was holding a digital gun to the head of my entire company. She explicitly promised to drag me into a federal penitentiary right alongside them if I refused to pay their blood debt. She did not wait for my response. She slammed the phone down, terminating the connection. The dial tone echoed in my silent bedroom, presenting a massive, terrifying new dilemma. My company was the livelihood for hundreds of innocent drivers and warehouse workers. If Allison triggered a federal raid, the resulting corporate paralysis would destroy thousands of lives. The war had just escalated from a family dispute to a federal-level disaster. The dial tone hummed in my ear like a flat line. I slowly lowered the phone to the nightstand, the sheer magnitude of Allison's threat crystallizing in the quiet darkness of my bedroom. She had not simply threatened my personal wealth, she had aimed a weapon of mass destruction directly at the very foundation of my logistics empire. I knew exactly what an investigation by the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division entailed. It was not a routine bureaucratic inquiry, it was a hostile, scorched-earth federal siege. They would instantly freeze every corporate asset, impound our communication servers, and lock down our operational capital. My entire fleet of heavy freight trucks and refrigerated transport vehicles would be grounded indefinitely, immediately breaching dozens of international shipping contracts. The ripple effect would be catastrophic and immediate. I employed over 3,000 hardworking men and women across the southern region. These were dedicated drivers, warehouse technicians, and logistics managers who relied on my weekly payroll to feed their families and keep a roof over their heads. If the federal government chained my loading docks shut based on Allison's heavily doctored financial ledgers, those innocent families would be financially devastated before the month ended. My daughter-in-law was fully prepared to obliterate thousands of innocent lives just to extort the cash necessary to save her own husband. The ruthless calculation of her blackmail left me breathless. I had spent 40 years building a pristine corporate reputation, enduring ruthless market fluctuations and vicious competitors, but the most severe existential threat my company had ever faced was currently sitting in a rented Texas mansion. I immediately contacted Dennis, summoning him back to the estate before the sun breached the horizon. I briefed him on the extortion call detailing Allison's explicit claim of possessing modified internal tax ledgers. Dennis arrived with a heavy suite of diagnostic equipment, his face set in a grim, deeply professional mask. He stated that my corporate firewalls were military-grade, meaning a remote external hack was highly improbable. The breach had to be domestic and physical. He marched directly into my ground-floor home office, the central nerve center where I occasionally reviewed sensitive corporate data on a secured terminal. Dennis unpacked a sophisticated radio frequency scanner and began a meticulous inch-by-inch sweep of the entire room. He ran the device along the mahogany baseboards behind the heavy leather-bound bookshelves and underneath the antique desk I had inherited from my late father. The silence in the room was broken only by the rhythmic mechanical clicking of his diagnostic gear. I watched him work, my mind racing through every single interaction I had shared with Jared and Allison over the past year. How could she possibly access my isolated network when I kept my financial records strictly partitioned from the household wireless system? Dennis methodically dismantled the wall outlets and inspected the ventilation grates, hunting for the digital parasite bleeding my company dry. He explained that forging a tax ledger required sustained high-level access to my primary data streams, capturing my password inputs and mirrored screen data over an extended period. The scanner suddenly emitted a sharp, high-pitched screech as Dennis passed the wand directly behind the primary network terminal router resting on the credenza. Dennis dropped to his knees and wedged his hand into the narrow gap between the heavy oak credenza and the wall. With a sharp, calculated tug, he extracted a small, innocuous-looking black box, roughly the size of a deck of cards. It was hardwired directly into the primary Ethernet port of my main terminal, completely hidden from casual view by a tangle of legitimate power cables. Dennis held the device up to the desk lamp, his eyes narrowing as he identified the specific make and model. He explained in a cold, clinical tone that it was a highly sophisticated military-grade packet sniffer and external transmission router. This parasitic device had been silently copying every keystroke, intercepting every secure corporate email, and cloning every financial spreadsheet I accessed, beaming the raw data directly to an external server. The blood drained from my face as a very specific memory slammed into my mind. 6 months ago, I hosted a Sunday family dinner. Jared and Allison had arrived early. I remembered clearly that Allison had spilled a full glass of red wine in the hallway just outside my office door. While I was in the kitchen scrambling for cleaning supplies, she had remained alone in the corridor. It was the perfect engineered distraction. She had feigned clumsiness to secure the exact 60 seconds of unmonitored access required to plug this insidious device directly into my network hub. She had smiled at me over dinner, eating the food I provided while actively establishing a digital pipeline to steal my corporate identity. The sheer calculating patience required to plant the device and harvest my data for half a year was staggering. My daughter-in-law had been operating as an embedded corporate spy inside my own home. Dennis gripped the black router quickly, calculating the transmission logs on his diagnostic laptop. He stated that we needed to instantly shut down the primary corporate servers and dispatch emergency legal injunctions to protect the company data from further manipulation. But as he reached for the terminal keyboard, a series of incredibly heavy, authoritative knocks echoed violently through the quiet morning house. The pounding was not the hesitant knock of a delivery driver or the polite tapping of a neighbor. It was the aggressive, rhythmic demand of absolute authority, rattling the reinforced glass of the front entryway. I walked slowly out of the office and down the main corridor, my heart hammering a brutal rhythm against my ribs. Through the side panel windows, I saw 4 dark sedans parked haphazardly across my driveway, their blue and red emergency lights flashing silently in the gray dawn. A cluster of men and women wearing dark tactical windbreakers stood shoulder to shoulder on my front porch. Emblazoned across their backs in bold yellow lettering was the unmistakable acronym of the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division. Allison had not been bluffing, and she had not waited for my final answer. She had already executed her catastrophic threat, pulling the trigger on the federal audit the moment she hung up the phone. The lead agent raised his heavy fist and slammed it against the door a second time, shouting loudly that they possessed a federal search warrant for the premises. The digital device resting on my desk was no longer a secret weapon to be deactivated. It was now a critical piece of federal evidence. The walls of my own home were suddenly closing in, and the battle for my company had just breached my front door. I unlocked the heavy mahogany front door and stepped back as 12 armed agents wearing dark tactical windbreakers immediately swarmed into my foyer. They moved with a terrifying coordinated efficiency, completely ignoring my presence as they systematically secured the entire ground floor of my estate. A team of digital forensic specialists marched directly past me into my home office and began violently ripping the primary hard drives from my computer terminals. They shoved my personal files, corporate ledgers, and encrypted backup drives into heavy plastic evidence bins, securing them with bright red tamper evidence seals. I was unceremoniously escorted into my own kitchen by 2 stern-faced enforcement officers and ordered to sit at the granite island. The lead investigator, a sharp-featured man with cold, calculating eyes, pulled out one of my dining chairs and sat directly across from me. He slammed a massive 3-ring binder onto the countertop, explicitly stating that my logistics empire was officially under a comprehensive federal lockdown. He aggressively flipped open the binder to reveal the catastrophic digital files Allison had anonymously submitted to their division. The pages displayed a highly manipulated, entirely fabricated version of my internal corporate tax ledgers. The numbers printed on the pristine white paper falsely indicated massive systemic tax evasion, deliberate offshore money laundering, and millions of dollars in intentionally hidden operational revenue. The agent tapped the fraudulent spreadsheets with his pen, declaring that the government possessed absolute concrete proof of my criminal financial activities. He told me that my entire fleet of freight trucks was currently being grounded across 3 different states, and my corporate bank accounts were already frozen. He was looking at me not as a respected local business owner, but as a high-level corporate criminal who had finally been caught. The lead agent leaned across the granite island and launched into a relentless, brutal interrogation designed to completely shatter my psychological resolve. He fired off rapid accusations demanding immediate explanations for completely fabricated offshore wire transfers and fictitious shell companies listed in the doctored files. He promised that if I refused to cooperate with his investigation, I would spend the remainder of my natural life rotting inside a maximum security federal penitentiary. The sheer crushing weight of the sudden federal siege pressed down on my chest, making it incredibly difficult to draw a steady breath. Decades of grueling, honest labor of bleeding on frozen asphalt and building a completely clean logistics empire from absolutely nothing were rapidly evaporating right in front of my eyes. The agent hammered his fist against the countertop, shouting that my silence would only accelerate my total corporate destruction. He methodically described how the government would physically seize my warehouses, liquidate my transport vehicles, and publicly destroy my reputation in the national press. The extreme psychological pressure was immense, threatening to completely break my stoic composure. My heart hammered violently as I stared at the falsified numbers Allison had engineered to destroy my legacy. I felt the terrifying reality that one vindictive lie from my daughter-in-law was actually working to orchestrate my permanent ruin. I was watching my entire life's work being dismantled by a man who refused to believe a single word I said. I closed my eyes for a fraction of a second, absolutely refusing to let a completely fabricated digital lie erase 40 years of an honest, respectable life. I opened my eyes, stared directly into the lead agent's hostile face, and told him his division had been catastrophically manipulated. I stood up from the kitchen stool, ignoring the immediate warning shouts of the armed officers, and instructed the lead investigator to follow me into the basement. I marched down the wooden stairs with the agents closely trailing behind my back until we reached a massive industrial fireproof safe bolted directly into the concrete foundation. I spun the heavy steel dial input, the mechanical combination, and pulled the thick metal door wide open. I bypassed the digital backup drives entirely and reached into the deepest corner of the steel vault. I retrieved a stack of heavy physical leather-bound logbooks. These were my original, handwritten financial ledgers, dating back to the exact day I founded the logistics company in 1985. I carried the heavy books back upstairs and slammed them down onto the kitchen counter right next to Allison's fabricated binder. I opened the oldest ledger, revealing decades of meticulous, authentic, handwritten entries written in my own blue ink. I systematically dismantled the forged digital documents line by line, cross-referencing the fraudulent electronic data against my heavily documented physical paper trail. I showed the agents the original bank deposit slips, physical payroll receipts, and verified tax stamps that completely contradicted the anonymous digital submission. I proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that the digital files they possessed were not genuine corporate records, but a highly engineered, weaponized forgery designed specifically to frame me. Dennis stepped forward from the corner of the kitchen where he had been quietly observing the entire interrogation, holding his encrypted diagnostic laptop. He placed his screen directly in front of the lead federal agent and brought up the highly detailed tracking logs he had just pulled from the hidden military-grade router we found in my study. Dennis traced the exact digital pathway of the fraudulent tax ledgers, showing the precise timestamps when the authentic data was actively manipulated. He completely obliterated Allison's flawless facade by revealing the exact destination of the cloned information. The forensic diagnostic software proved with absolute certainty that the digital files were altered remotely from a specific IP address located in a gated luxury community in Texas. It was the exact same IP address registered to the mansion Jared and Allison were currently renting. The lead federal agent's deeply hostile demeanor shifted instantly as he stared at the concrete digital footprint, confirming the sophisticated deception. He realized with terrifying clarity that the Internal Revenue Service had been actively weaponized by a vindictive daughter-in-law attempting to execute a hostile corporate takeover. The sheer audacity of using a premier federal agency as a personal attack dog ignited a furious rage within the lead investigator. He grabbed the fabricated binder and aggressively ordered his tactical team to immediately cease all seizure operations on my property. He pulled out his secured communication device and violently pivoted the entire weight of the federal investigation directly onto Jared and Allison. He demanded an immediate federal arrest warrant for multiple counts of felony tax fraud, digital extortion, and extreme corporate sabotage. The crosshairs of this federal government had just swung entirely away from my logistics empire and locked directly onto my son in Texas. The lead federal investigator officially signed the release forms on my kitchen island, returning total operational control of my logistics empire before the morning was over. He formally apologized for the hostile intrusion and confirmed that my name was completely cleared of all fabricated tax evasion charges. The tactical team removed their tamper evidence seals from my servers and quietly exited my property carrying the heavy binders of forged evidence that would now be used to prosecute my son. As the last unmarked sedan rolled down my driveway, the sheer, suffocating magnitude of the betrayal finally settled deep into my bones. Jared and Allison had not simply thrown a reckless tantrum or made a desperate financial mistake. They had meticulously engineered a federal weapon designed to obliterate my freedom, my reputation, and the livelihoods of 3,000 innocent employees. They had sat in my dining room smiling over Sunday dinners while actively building a digital guillotine pointed directly at my neck. The realization fundamentally and permanently altered my psychological landscape. Every single lingering drop of fatherly mercy I possessed evaporated into the cold morning air. I was no longer a disappointed parent hoping for a miraculous moral turnaround or a negotiated family truce. The boy I had raised, the son I had bled for on frozen asphalt decades ago, was entirely dead to me. In his place stood a ruthless corporate predator who had actively tried to destroy my existence for a payout. I stared at the blank doorway, feeling a profound, icy clarity replace the shock and sorrow. There would be no more defensive maneuvers or passive reactions. The emotional severance was absolute and complete, leaving behind only the cold, rigid calculus of corporate warfare. I walked back into my study and looked at the military-grade router resting on my desk. The federal government was now actively building a massive criminal case against Jared, and the underground lending syndicate was undoubtedly still hunting him for their stolen $500,000. A weaker man would have simply locked his doors and waited for the legal system or the criminal underworld to slowly grind his treacherous son into dust. But waiting passively contradicted every single instinct that had built my company. I knew the federal bureaucracy moved with agonizing slowness, requiring months of subpoenas and endless grand jury testimonies before issuing a single arrest warrant. The syndicate was violent, but Jared was a cowardly opportunist who would likely use his remaining stolen funds to disappear across the southern border before the enforcers could breach his gated community. I could not leave the total destruction of his fraudulent empire to sheer chance. I had to actively personally dismantle the elaborate Texas facade he had constructed with my stolen resources. He was currently hiding behind a fabricated reputation, pretending to be a self-made real estate tycoon while actively defrauding new victims. He needed to be exposed and stripped of his stolen assets by the very man he had attempted to bury. I realized that sending lawyers or local law enforcement would only give him time to run or engineer another pathetic layer of corporate deception. I had to rip the foundation out from under his feet in a public, undeniable manner. I was going to tear down his entire false reality brick by stolen brick until absolutely nothing remained but the naked truth of his monumental treason against his own father. I immediately picked up my phone and contacted my corporate aviation broker, booking a private chartered jet out of the regional airfield. Commercial flights required entirely too much waiting, and I needed to establish an offensive perimeter in Texas before the sun went down. I summoned Bradley back to the estate and instructed him to pack his heaviest litigation files. My attorney arrived within the hour carrying a thick reinforced leather briefcase containing the official commercial lien invalidations, the sworn medical confession from Dr. Evans, and the certified bank statements proving Jared's extensive systemic fraud. I also commanded Dennis to pack his tactical surveillance gear and accompany us on the flight. I needed my top digital investigator to monitor the syndicate's movements and intercept any of Jared's desperate electronic communications while we were in the air. The three of us boarded the sleek private jet precisely at noon, leaving the humid Georgia morning behind us. We did not waste the 2-hour flight engaging in pointless small talk or debating the emotional morality of our mission. We utilized the quiet, pressurized cabin to establish a ruthless, airtight strategy. Bradley meticulously organized the weaponized legal documentation into sequential strike folders, preparing to legally annihilate any defense Jared might attempt to mount. I sat by the window watching the clouds pass far below, feeling the cold, heavy anticipation of the impending confrontation. Halfway across the Louisiana border, the quiet hum of the jet engines was interrupted by a sharp electronic chime from Dennis's diagnostic laptop. He had spent the first hour of the flight aggressively tapping into the external servers Jared was using to operate his fraudulent Texas real estate firm. Dennis turned his screen toward Bradley and me, pulling up a highly encrypted digital communication he had just successfully intercepted. It was an extravagant, highly polished electronic invitation sent out to hundreds of wealthy local investors, commercial developers, and regional politicians. Jared and Allison were hosting a massive exclusive grand opening gala for their new luxury real estate brokerage that very evening. The digital flyer boasted about their vast, unverified corporate backing and promised lucrative high-yield property investments to anyone attending the black tie event. They were utilizing the temporary safety of their gated luxury community to throw a lavish party actively scamming the Texas elite, while federal agents and armed syndicate enforcers were simultaneously hunting them down. The sheer staggering arrogance required to host a public celebration while operating on stolen time and stolen money was almost unbelievable. Jared believed his digital walls and physical security gates made him completely untouchable. He assumed he had successfully outrun his crimes and was now aggressively expanding his fraudulent empire into new, lucrative territories. I stared at the elegant digital invitation, taking note of the precise time and location of the evening gala. My son had conveniently gathered all of his wealthy targets, local politicians, and false allies into one single opulent room. The stage was perfectly set for a catastrophic public reckoning, and we were scheduled to land in Texas just 2 hours before the first champagne cork popped. The wheels of the chartered private jet hit the scorching Texas tarmac with a heavy thud, instantly signaling the beginning of the final offensive. I did not waste a single moment staring out the window or marveling at the sprawling southern landscape. The second the cabin doors opened, the oppressive, humid heat rushed in, but my focus remained entirely cold and rigidly fixed on the operational timeline. Dennis had already arranged for a heavily tinted luxury sport utility vehicle to wait directly on the runway, allowing us to completely bypass the standard civilian terminal. Bradley and I climbed into the spacious rear seating area while Dennis immediately took the wheel, connecting his encrypted diagnostic laptop to the vehicle's internal navigation system. We had less than 2 hours before the fraudulent grand opening gala commenced, but I explicitly instructed Dennis to navigate away from the targeted event space. We were not going to blindly crash a public party without first securing absolute structural leverage over the entire situation. I directed Dennis to drive us straight into the heart of the downtown financial district toward a highly exclusive commercial real estate holding firm. This specific firm managed the primary leases and underlying mortgages for the most prestigious corporate addresses in the city, including the opulent venue Jared had selected for his massive scam. We pulled up to a towering glass and steel skyscraper, projecting the kind of intimidating wealth designed to make ordinary citizens feel incredibly small. But I was not an ordinary citizen, and I was certainly not intimidated by corporate architecture. I had spent 4 decades navigating the ruthless waters of high-stakes commerce, and I was stepping directly back into my natural environment. We walked through the polished revolving doors, moving with a synchronized predatory momentum that forced the lobby security personnel to immediately step aside. We bypassed the reception desk entirely, and Bradley utilized his top-tier legal credentials to demand an immediate, unscheduled meeting with the senior managing partners of the holding firm. We were escorted into a massive corner boardroom overlooking the city skyline, where 3 highly confused executives demanded to know the meaning of the intrusion. I did not sit down or offer any polite corporate pleasantries. I dropped a certified financial dossier onto the center of their polished mahogany table, proving my absolute immediate liquidity. I informed them that I was fully aware of the leveraged commercial debt they held on the specific luxury building currently housing my son's fraudulent real estate brokerage. I offered them an aggressive, heavily inflated cash buyout for the immediate transfer of the underlying commercial mortgage and the physical deed to that exact property. The executives attempted to hesitate, citing standard bureaucratic processing times and complex corporate protocols. Bradley instantly dismantled their hesitation by producing the certified legal documentation outlining the massive federal tax fraud and criminal syndicate ties currently infecting their tenant. He calmly explained that keeping the property meant they would be directly entangled in an impending federal raid and a highly publicized corporate scandal. Faced with the immediate threat of federal asset seizure and public ruin, the partners eagerly accepted my aggressive cash offer. Within 45 minutes, the expedited wire transfers cleared the banking system and the emergency legal contracts were aggressively notarized. I walked out of that skyscraper holding the absolute legal deed to the building. I was now formally and indisputably Jared's ultimate landlord. With the physical deed securely locked inside Bradley's reinforced leather briefcase, I returned to the waiting vehicle to make my final preparations for the evening. I changed into a sharply tailored, understated charcoal suit I had brought specifically for this precise confrontation. I wore no flashy accessories, no ostentatious watches, and absolutely nothing designed to artificially project wealth. My power was quite absolute and entirely grounded in 40 years of brutal, relentless reality. We drove toward the upscale commercial district as the Texas sun finally dipped below the horizon, casting long, dark shadows across the sprawling city. The venue Jared had selected for his grand opening gala was sickeningly opulent. As we pulled up to the curb, a fleet of imported luxury vehicles was actively being processed by a swarm of rushing valets. A pristine red carpet stretched from the street directly up to the towering entrance, flanked by heavy velvet ropes and aggressive private security guards holding digital guest lists. The sheer superficial nature of the event was physically repulsive. Jared and Allison had constructed a glittering hollow monument to their own monumental greed, actively using my stolen resources to parade themselves as self-made elite visionaries. I watched wealthy local investors, commercial developers, and regional politicians laughing and clinking crystal glasses, entirely oblivious to the fact that they were walking directly into a massive federal and criminal trap. The contrast between my stoic, silent presence in the idling vehicle and the loud, fabricated wealth radiating from the building was incredibly stark. I was not a guest seeking an investment opportunity or a father looking for a tearful reconciliation. I was the absolute owner of the ground they were standing on, and I had arrived to manually demolish the fake empire my son had cowardly built. I stepped out of the vehicle and walked deliberately up the pristine red carpet, completely ignoring the shouting valets and the confused whispers of the arriving elite. The private security guards at the main entrance immediately stepped forward to block my path, raising their hands and demanding to see my digital invitation. Bradley smoothly intercepted them, flashing the freshly notarized property deed and calmly informing the head of security that I was the new legal owner of the entire commercial building. The guards hesitated, their authority instantly evaporating as they stepped aside and allowed me to pass the velvet ropes unquestioned. I walked through the grand double doors of the main ballroom, stepping into a blinding atmosphere of extreme, excessive luxury. The music was incredibly loud, pulsating through the high ceilings, while hundreds of elegantly dressed guests mingled around towering champagne towers and elaborate ice sculptures. I navigated through the dense crowd, moving like a silent, unseen shark, gliding through a sea of completely oblivious prey. No one paid any attention to the grim older man in the charcoal suit, methodically cutting a straight path toward the center of the room. I spotted Jared instantly. He was standing on a slightly elevated platform holding court with a circle of wealthy local politicians, radiating a sickeningly fake aura of supreme confidence and absolute success. He was gesturing expansively, holding a delicate crystal champagne flute in his right hand, completely absorbed in his own magnificent lie. I stopped 10 feet away from the platform and simply stood perfectly still. Jared turned his head to laugh at a joke, and his eyes swept casually across the crowd. Our eyes locked. The fake smile instantly vanished from his face, replaced by a sudden horrifying expression of absolute pure terror. The delicate crystal champagne flute slipped directly through his trembling fingers and shattered violently against the polished marble floor. The sharp shatter of the crystal champagne flute was entirely swallowed by the pulsating bass of the string quartet, but the psychological impact rippled outward from Jared like a physical shockwave. The blood completely drained from his face, leaving him looking like a terrified child caught in a monstrous lie. He stared at me for 2 agonizing seconds before pure survival instinct overrode his paralysis. He lunged off the elevated platform and practically sprinted across the polished marble floor toward me. He completely abandoned his wealthy political guests, leaving them mid-sentence as he desperately closed the distance between us. Jared grabbed my upper arm with a vice-like grip, his fingers digging frantically into the fabric of my charcoal suit. He leaned in close, his breath smelling heavily of expensive liquor and pure panic. He hissed into my ear, demanding to know what I was doing in Texas and how I had bypassed his security perimeter. He did not wait for an answer. He began aggressively pulling me toward a heavily draped service corridor located near the catering kitchen, desperate to hide me from the prying eyes of his high society marks. He whispered frantically that we could negotiate a massive settlement in private and that he would write me a certified check right now if I simply turned around and walked out the back door. He begged me not to ruin the pinnacle of his professional career, promising to repay every single cent with triple interest. He was frantically attempting to contain a blazing inferno with a handful of cheap paper towels. His grip on my arm tightened as he tried to physically muscle me into the dark hallway, away from the glittering lights and the inquisitive stares of the Texas elite. I planted my feet firmly onto the marble floor, transforming my posture into an immovable object. I easily broke his frantic grip with a single sharp twist of my shoulder. I did not lower my voice to indulge his pathetic attempt at damage control. I looked at the terrified man trembling before me and felt absolutely nothing but cold professional resolve. I smoothed the sleeve of my jacket and walked deliberately past him, stepping directly onto the elevated presentation platform he had just abandoned. The string quartet was still playing, but the musicians faltered as I confidently approached the main podium. I reached out and tapped the primary microphone, sending a sharp, heavy thud echoing through the massive ballroom sound system. The music abruptly ceased. Hundreds of conversations died instantly as every single eye in the opulent venue turned entirely toward me. I gripped the edges of the podium and spoke with a booming, authoritative voice that commanded the room. I introduced myself not as Jared's father, but as the founder and chief executive officer of the logistics empire that had unknowingly financed this entire fraudulent spectacle. I pulled the certified bank statements and the signed confessions from my interior jacket pocket, holding them up under the blazing crystal chandeliers. I loudly informed the captivated audience of wealthy investors and regional politicians that the man they were currently celebrating was a common thief. I explicitly detailed how Jared had forged medical documents, attempted to lock me in a psychiatric ward, and illegally drained my corporate accounts to fund his fabricated real estate brokerage. I announced to the silent ballroom that the massive seed capital backing their promised high-yield investments was entirely stolen from my company. I held up the notarized property deed, stating clearly that I had legally purchased this very building 3 hours ago, and that Jared was currently trespassing on my commercial property. I laid out the absolute undeniable truth, laying bare the monumental scam they had all been invited to fund. A collective sharp gasp rippled through the massive ballroom. The glittering facade of the grand opening gala disintegrated in real time, replaced by a tense, suffocating atmosphere of sudden financial panic. The wealthy elite, the commercial developers, and the regional politicians who had just been clinking crystal glasses with my son suddenly realized they were standing in the middle of a massive federal crime scene. Angry muttering erupted across the crowd as expensive silk dresses and tailored tuxedos rustled in agitation. Dozens of guests immediately pulled out their smartphones, frantically checking their bank accounts and desperately attempting to cancel the wire transfers they had authorized earlier that evening. The wealthy marks Jared had spent months carefully grooming were actively cutting their losses and preparing to run. I watched the realization wash over the room as the guests physically backed away from Jared, treating him like a highly contagious disease. His pristine reputation, the carefully constructed image of a brilliant self-made real estate tycoon, evaporated completely into the chilled air conditioning. He stood completely isolated in the center of the marble floor, entirely surrounded by the very people he had intended to exploit. The investors glared at him with pure venom, recognizing the sheer audacity of his scam. Jared looked frantically around the room, his mouth opening and closing silently, unable to formulate a single word of defense against the absolute weight of my documented evidence. His fraudulent empire was crumbling to dust in front of a live audience. Before Jared could even attempt to salvage his completely obliterated reputation, a sharp, hysterical scream pierced the chaotic murmuring of the crowd. Allison stood near the grand entrance, her face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. Her elegant designer gown contrasted sharply with the violent animalistic fury radiating from her eyes. She recognized instantly that the sophisticated federal blackmail scheme she had engineered had failed spectacularly, and her luxurious Texas lifestyle was actively being dismantled. She completely abandoned any pretense of high society grace and launched into a vicious offensive. Allison pointed a trembling finger directly at the podium and shrieked at the top of her lungs. She screamed that I was a dangerous, violently estranged stalker who had spent the last 2 years obsessively harassing her family. She loudly proclaimed to the panicked investors that my documents were entirely fabricated and that I was suffering from a severe psychotic break. She did not stop at character assassination. Allison aggressively signaled the heavy private security detail she had hired to protect the gala. She ordered the 6 armed guards stationed around the perimeter to forcibly tackle me to the ground and physically remove me from the premises immediately. The guards, massive men wearing tight black suits and earpieces, did not hesitate to follow the command of the woman signing their paychecks. They drew their batons and charged aggressively through the dispersing crowd, rushing the stage from 3 different angles. They were preparing to execute a violent physical takedown right in front of the horrified Texas elite. The financial confrontation had instantly escalated into an imminent physical assault, and the heavy boots of the private security team were already pounding against the wooden steps of the presentation platform. The heavy footfalls of the 3 closest private security guards reverberated across the wooden presentation platform, instantly breaking the shocked silence caused by the shattering crystal glass. These were massive men built for pure intimidation and trained for immediate violent physical extractions. They closed the distance with terrifying speed, their black tactical batons drawn and gripped tightly in their massive hands. The suffocating tension in the opulent ballroom spiked to an absolute breaking point as a brutal physical assault seemed completely inevitable. The remaining elite guests held their collective breath, actively bracing for the ugly public spectacle of an older man being violently subdued and dragged bleeding across the pristine marble floor. Behind the advancing line of hired muscle, I watched Jared's posture shift dramatically. The sheer, paralyzing terror that had completely frozen him just seconds earlier began to rapidly melt away. He visibly straightened his spine, rolling his shoulders back and smoothly adjusting the silk lapels of his custom-tailored tuxedo. A sickeningly arrogant smirk slowly crawled across his face as he watched the guards close in on my position. He truly believed his fabricated Texas empire and his expensive rented muscle were enough to insulate him from the brutal consequences of his actions. He believed that Allison's hysterical screaming had successfully flipped the narrative by labeling me a delusional, dangerous stalker. He was entirely relying on brute physical force to permanently silence the truth and forcefully eject me from his carefully constructed fantasy world. He thought he had successfully neutralized the final threat to his scam. The lead security guard reached out with a massive hand aimed directly at my chest, entirely prepared to drive me backward off the elevated stage. Before his heavy fingers could even brush the fabric of my charcoal suit, Bradley stepped smoothly and flawlessly between us. My attorney did not flinch back or raise his hands in a defensive posture. He moved with the absolute chilling confidence of a man holding an unbeatable royal flush. He snapped open his reinforced leather briefcase and swiftly extracted a thick stack of legally bound paperwork. Bradley thrust the heavy documents directly into the chest of the towering security captain, forcing the massive man to instinctively grab the papers or let them fall. The guard paused, his aggressive momentum instantly broken by the sudden insertion of official legal documentation. Bradley spoke with a sharp, piercing legal authority that cut cleanly through the ambient noise of the panicked ballroom. He loudly instructed the head of security and the remaining attending guests to look very closely at the embossed state seals and the certified municipal signatures stamped across the front page. He announced that the document they were currently holding was the absolute, unchallengeable commercial deed to the entire physical property. Bradley explicitly clarified that the man they were preparing to violently assault was not a deranged stalker or an uninvited trespasser. I was the legally recognized owner of the building, the ground they were standing on, and the very venue they were using to host their fraudulent gala. He pointed out the rapid cash buyout clauses and the immediate transfer of ownership verified by the downtown holding firm just hours ago. The revelation hit the room with the force of a physical blow, completely freezing the security team in their tracks. Bradley turned his piercing gaze toward the crowded ballroom, amplifying his voice so every single wealthy investor could hear the absolute truth. He officially announced that I possessed total legal sovereignty over the commercial space, entirely nullifying Jared's fraudulent lease agreement due to the active federal criminal investigation tied directly to his fake brokerage. I stepped around Bradley, moving directly to the edge of the stage, and addressed the paralyzed security team. I locked eyes with the captain and delivered a single, absolute, non-negotiable command. I ordered the immediate total eviction of the entire party. I explicitly informed the guards that their employment contract was tied to the building management, which I now completely controlled. I told them they were no longer working for the trembling con artist hiding behind them, but were now operating under my direct supreme authority. The lead security guard looked down at the certified court deed in his hands, recognizing the absolute legal reality of the situation. He recognized the undeniable authority radiating from my posture and the catastrophic legal liability of assaulting the true property owner. He immediately lowered his tactical baton and took a slow, deliberate step backward. His team mirrored his exact movements, holstering their weapons and refusing to lay a single finger on me. The physical threat evaporated instantly, leaving Jared and Allison completely exposed and stripped of their rented protection. The arrogant smirk entirely vanished from Jared's face, permanently replaced by the horrifying realization that he was completely trapped. I had not just crashed his extravagant party, I had systematically purchased the very walls surrounding him and turned his own hired muscle into my personal eviction force. The sheer absolute finality of my eviction order shattered the last remaining illusion of Jared's fabricated empire. The wealthy Texas elite commercial developers and local politicians did not wait for the security guards to begin ushering them out. A massive, chaotic stampede erupted across the ballroom as hundreds of furious investors rushed aggressively toward the main exits. They were shouting violently, demanding their money back, and frantically dialing their financial managers to halt any pending wire transfers they had authorized. The opulent gala dissolved into a brutal, frantic scramble for the door. Jared's carefully constructed reputation dissolved in real time, completely pulverized under the heavy weight of his undeniable fraud. He stood frozen on the stage, watching his entire future evaporate into a chaotic sea of fleeing victims. He reached out weakly toward the fleeing crowd, but absolutely no one looked back to offer him a shred of sympathy. However, the evening was far from over. Amidst the deafening roar of shouting investors and shattering crystal glasses, a loud, violent crash echoed from the rear of the venue. The heavy stainless steel service doors leading directly from the catering kitchen were kicked violently open. The remaining guests scrambled out of the way as 5 men wearing dark, heavy suits marched purposefully into the rapidly emptying ballroom. These were not local police officers or federal agents arriving to serve warrants. They moved with a terrifying, silent coordination, completely ignoring the fleeing elite and the confused valets. I recognized the cold, dead eyes and the brutal posture of the men immediately. They were the underground syndicate enforcers from Georgia, the violent debt collectors Jared had foolishly attempted to outrun. They had finally tracked down their stolen $500,000, and they had walked directly into the shattered remains of my son's life. The 5 heavily built syndicate enforcers fanned out across the grand ballroom with ruthless military precision. The lead figure, a broad-shouldered man with a jagged scar cutting across his jawline, gave a subtle nod to his subordinates. 2 of the men immediately marched to the towering double doors and forcefully engaged the heavy brass deadbolts, locking everyone inside. The sharp metallic clatter echoed like a gunshot over the terrified murmurs of the remaining elite guests. Jared retreated until his back hit the edge of the elevated presentation platform, completely trapped like a cornered animal. The remaining private security guards, recognizing the lethal professionalism of the Georgian enforcers, quietly backed against the walls, refusing to intervene in a dispute that was clearly beyond their pay grade. The syndicate boss stepped forward, closing the distance until he stood just inches from Jared's trembling frame. He calmly pulled back his tailored suit jacket, revealing the dull black steel of a heavy-caliber firearm tucked casually into his waistband. He spoke in a low, gravelly voice that carried a terrifying promise of extreme violence. He demanded the immediate return of his $500,000, explicitly detailing how Jared had foolishly ignored their encrypted calls and arrogantly assumed he could hide his stolen wealth in a gated Texas community. Allison attempted to silently slip away toward the catering corridor, but a massive enforcer instantly blocked her path, crossing his arms and forcing her back into the center of the room. The absolute reality of their fatal miscalculation crashed down upon them. They were entirely sealed inside their own fraudulent monument surrounded by angry victims and violent predators. He reminded Jared that underground banking contracts did not require a judge to enforce collection. The grace period had officially expired and the time for violent extraction had arrived. Jared frantically scanned the massive room, searching desperately for a single sympathetic face among the crowd. He looked toward the wealthy Texas investors he had spent months aggressively courting, but they offered him nothing but looks of absolute disgust and simmering rage. He looked toward the private security team he had paid handsomely to protect his physical safety, but they remained completely motionless, honoring my strict eviction orders. Finally, he looked at the syndicate boss, who slowly drew the heavy firearm from his waistband, letting it rest casually against his thigh. The last remaining shred of Jared's false bravado completely shattered. His knees instantly buckled underneath him, sending him crashing down onto the polished marble floor. He collapsed, entirely ruining his custom-tailored tuxedo as he began to weep with loud, pathetic, heaving sobs. He scrambled forward on his hands and knees, crawling desperately across the floor until he reached my position. He reached out with trembling hands and aggressively gripped the hem of my charcoal trousers, tears streaming down his flushed face. He begged me to open my encrypted corporate portals and wire the syndicate their $500,000 immediately. He screamed that he was my only son, leveraging every possible drop of historical familial guilt he could manifest. He pleaded for his life, promising that he would instantly dissolve the fraudulent real estate brokerage drop, the malicious medical guardianship petitions, and return to Georgia to become a respectful subordinate. He babbled uncontrollably, offering empty, worthless promises forged entirely in the white-hot heat of imminent physical destruction. The display of pure, unadulterated cowardice disgusted every single person watching the pathetic spectacle. He was a man who happily played the role of a ruthless tycoon, but possessed absolutely no backbone when the brutal consequences of his adult decisions finally caught up to him. I stood perfectly still, looking down at the sobbing, hyperventilating man groveling on the floor at my feet. I searched the absolute depths of my heart for a single solitary shred of paternal instinct, a tiny flicker of mercy for the little boy who used to ride shotgun in my freight truck. There was absolutely nothing left inside my chest but a cold, echoing void. The decades of constant financial anxiety, the relentless emotional manipulation, and the catastrophic federal sabotage had permanently burned away any lingering affection. I spoke with a quiet, unyielding authority that cut straight through his pathetic weeping. I informed Jared that the federal agents in Georgia already possessed the forged tax ledgers and the illegally cloned data he had harvested from my network. I explained that my corporate accounts were permanently locked down by my own strategic design, and I would not authorize a single solitary penny to save him, even if the vaults were wide open. I firmly and violently detached my trouser leg from his desperate, frantic grip. I took 3 slow, deliberate steps backward, putting undeniable physical distance between us. I gestured openly to the syndicate boss, completely and officially relinquishing any parental claim to the weeping man on the floor. I stated clearly that the debt belonged entirely to Jared, and I would not interfere with their collection methods. The physical act of stepping aside permanently sealed his fate. The syndicate boss smiled a grim, predatory smile, exposing a row of slightly crooked teeth. He stepped forward and roughly grabbed Jared by the collar of his ruined tuxedo, hauling him violently halfway off the marble floor. The enforcer did not waste a single second negotiating. He forcefully ripped the heavy diamond-encrusted platinum watch directly from Jared's wrist, tossing the expensive timepiece over his shoulder to a waiting subordinate. Another enforcer marched forward, pulling a thick stack of folded vehicle titles from his inner suit pocket and slamming them aggressively onto a nearby glass cocktail table. He produced a heavy steel pen and pressed the cold barrel of his firearm directly against the back of Jared's skull, demanding his immediate legal signatures, transferring total ownership of the imported sports cars parked outside. Jared shook violently, his chest heaving as he frantically scribbled his name across the documents through blinding tears. Allison sobbed loudly against the wall, her elegant designer gown completely ruined by a spilled glass of red wine she had dropped in her panic. She watched her luxurious stolen lifestyle being systematically dismantled by violent criminals. Just as Jared forcefully signed his name across the final vehicle title, transferring his last remaining asset, a sudden blinding wash of alternating blue and red lights aggressively pierced the tall ballroom windows. The violent strobing illumination painted the terrified faces of the remaining guests in harsh, frantic colors. The deafening screech of heavy armored tires tearing across the pavement outside signaled a massive coordinated arrival. Dozens of heavily armed tactical agents wearing dark federal windbreakers swarmed the entire perimeter of the commercial building. The Federal Bureau of Investigation had officially arrived to dismantle the fraud. The reinforced glass of the grand ballroom entrance exploded inward, raining jagged crystal across the polished marble floor as a heavy tactical battering ram breached the venue. Dozens of federal agents flooded the opulent space, their boots crunching over the shattered glass and discarded champagne flutes. They moved with absolute military precision, their weapons drawn and their tactical flashlights cutting through the dim, romantic lighting of the gala. The sudden violent intrusion ignited absolute pandemonium among the remaining elite guests and the terrified waitstaff. Amidst the deafening screams and the frantic scramble for the secondary exits, the Georgian syndicate boss reacted with the cold, calculated survival instinct of a seasoned criminal. He instantly recognized that a raid of this staggering magnitude was entirely outside his local jurisdiction and immediately assessed the lethal risk. He did not attempt to hold his ground or negotiate with the armored federal strike team pouring through the lobby. He simply shoved the freshly signed vehicle deeds deep into his tailored suit jacket, snatched the diamond-encrusted watch from his subordinate, and barked a sharp command. The 5 heavily built enforcers instantly abandoned Jared, melting seamlessly into the chaotic crowd and slipping out through the swinging kitchen service doors before the federal perimeter could fully close around the catering corridors. They vanished into the Texas night, successfully escaping with a massive fraction of my son's stolen wealth, leaving Jared completely alone to face the absolute wrath of the United States government. The trap had been definitively sprung, and the violent predators were fleeing the sinking ship before the iron bars could snap shut. The federal agents completely ignored the retreating figures of the underground syndicate, their operational focus locked entirely on a singular primary target. A tightly coordinated squad of heavily armored investigators bypassed the screaming crowd and swarmed the elevated presentation platform, moving directly toward my son. Jared remained frozen on his knees, his expensive custom tuxedo stained with tears and spilled wine, completely paralyzed by the sheer suffocating reality of his total destruction. He did not attempt to run or fight as the lead tactical agent grabbed him by the scruff of his ruined collar and hauled him violently to his feet. The agent spun Jared around with brutal efficiency, slamming him face first onto a long, elegant catering table. Crystal serving platters and delicate hors d'oeuvres scattered across the floor, crashing loudly as Jared's chest hit the heavy wooden surface. The cold, unforgiving steel of federal handcuffs clicked sharply around his wrists, completely neutralizing the man who had arrogantly believed he could outsmart the law. The lead investigator leaned over Jared's trembling shoulder and loudly read him his Miranda rights, his voice echoing over the frantic cries of the dispersing Texas elite. He explicitly listed the catastrophic litany of federal charges currently bearing down on my son. Jared was being formally arrested for massive interstate wire fraud, aggressive systemic tax evasion, and the illegal orchestration of a fraudulent commercial enterprise. The crushing weight of the federal statute slammed into Jared, physically deflating his posture as he realized he was not merely facing a civil lawsuit or a quiet bankruptcy. He was being permanently removed from society, destined for a concrete federal cell, completely stripped of his fake wealth, his stolen corporate empire, and every single illusion of grandeur he had so desperately manufactured. As Jared sobbed incoherently against the ruined catering table, a sharp, hysterical wail erupted from the perimeter of the platform. Allison, recognizing the absolute undeniable finality of the federal raid, immediately executed a ruthless and entirely predictable pivot. She frantically backed away from her handcuffed husband, physically distancing herself from the epicenter of the legal disaster. She threw her hands in the air, tears streaming down her perfectly contoured face, transforming instantly into the ultimate innocent victim. She cried out to the surrounding federal agents, her voice thick with manufactured terror, claiming she had absolutely no knowledge of the stolen corporate funds or the illegal wire transfers. She screamed that Jared had violently coerced her into participating in the real estate brokerage, manipulating her signature and keeping her completely in the dark regarding his criminal offshore banking activities. Allison threw her husband entirely to the wolves without a single second of hesitation, actively volunteering to testify against him in federal court to save her own skin. She pleaded with the lead investigator, babbling frantically that she was simply a terrified wife, trapped in a toxic, financially abusive marriage, completely blind to the magnitude of Jared's multi-state extortion scheme. She attempted to leverage her ruined designer gown and her smeared makeup to project an aura of total helplessness, hoping the federal tactical team would view her as collateral damage rather than a co-conspirator. The sheer, unadulterated treachery of her performance was staggering, highlighting the absolute moral bankruptcy of a woman perfectly willing to watch the man she married rot in a federal penitentiary if it meant she could walk away completely untouched by the catastrophic legal fallout of their shared extortion plot. I watched Allison perform her desperate weeping monologue, feeling a profound sense of absolute disgust directed at her pathetic attempt to escape federal justice. I refused to let the architect of my near destruction simply walk out the front doors wearing the mask of an innocent, abused wife. I stepped forward, cutting smoothly through the circle of armed tactical agents, and approached the lead federal investigator managing the chaotic scene. I did not raise my voice or engage in Allison's hysterical theatrical display. Instead, I reached into the breast pocket of my tailored charcoal suit and withdrew a single, heavy, encrypted flash drive. I held the small metallic device up under the glaring ballroom lights, holding the absolute key to her total destruction in the palm of my hand. I spoke with a quiet, lethal clarity, officially presenting the drive to the federal agent as the final, undeniable piece of the criminal puzzle. I explicitly detailed the contents of the encrypted file, explaining that it contained the precise digital footprints, the raw spyware router logs, and the highly specific IP addresses, confirming the true origin of the corporate sabotage. Furthermore, I revealed that the drive held the recovered audio recordings of Allison personally threatening to trigger the fraudulent IRS audit against my logistics empire. I systematically stripped away her fabricated innocence, proving to the federal authorities that Allison was not a blind, terrified victim dragged along by a criminal husband. I provided the concrete, irrefutable digital evidence that she was the singular calculating mastermind behind the entire extortion scheme. The very architect who had personally plugged the military-grade packet sniffer into my home network. Allison's fake tears instantly vanished, her face contorting into an expression of pure, unadulterated horror as the lead agent reached out to accept the drive. The lead federal investigator did not hesitate or question the heavy metallic flash drive resting in his palm. He signaled sharply to a junior tactical agent carrying a reinforced field laptop strapped securely across his tactical vest. The younger agent immediately unclipped the device, placing it flat onto an overturned serving cart, and rapidly booted the encrypted operating system. The lead investigator slotted the drive into the secure port and punched in the master decryption key I provided. Rows of raw data spyware router logs and highly specific targeted IP addresses instantly cascaded across the glowing screen. The investigator leaned in close, his experienced eyes rapidly scanning the undeniable digital footprints that completely exposed the staggering depth of the corporate sabotage. He read the intercepted email chains detailing the fraudulent medical conspiracy explicitly designed to lock me in a high-security psychiatric ward and permanently strip my assets. He played a brief, highly compressed audio file where Allison's own voice echoed sharply from the laptop speakers, actively instructing Jared on exactly how to trigger the targeted federal IRS audit against my logistics empire. The absolute, undeniable proof of her cyber crimes painted a vivid, horrifying picture of a ruthless, calculating predator who had masterminded a multi-million-dollar extortion scheme from the shadows. The investigator straightened his posture, his face hardening into a mask of pure professional disgust. He looked away from the glowing screen and turned his hardened gaze directly toward the weeping woman attempting to cower near the grand entrance. The meticulously constructed narrative of the terrified, abused wife completely disintegrated under the crushing, unyielding weight of hard digital forensics. Allison was no longer a victim, but the singular driving force behind a massive federal conspiracy. The lead investigator raised his hand, executing a swift tactical gesture that instantly redirected the focus of his entire strike team. 4 heavily armored federal agents pivoted away from the ruined catering tables and moved with synchronized, lethal precision to surround Allison. The sudden shift in operational focus caught her entirely off guard. Her fabricated tears vanished instantly, replaced by a sudden, horrifying realization that her masterful deception had failed spectacularly in front of an armed federal squad. The investigator stepped forward, holding up the laptop screen, and calmly recited the specific federal statutes she had aggressively violated, including wire fraud, corporate espionage, and conspiracy to commit extortion. The fragile mask of the innocent, battered housewife shattered completely into a million jagged pieces, exposing the vicious, desperate criminal hiding underneath. As the agents moved in to secure her wrists, Allison finally snapped. She unleashed a wild, feral shriek, completely abandoning any remaining pretense of high society grace. She fought the physical restraint with pure animalistic fury, thrashing her arms and kicking wildly at the tactical officers attempting to loudly read her Miranda rights. The brutal physical struggle instantly destroyed her perfectly curated aesthetic. Her expensive designer gowns snagged and tore aggressively against the heavy black tactical gear, while her flawless hair unraveled into a chaotic, tangled mess. The expensive diamond jewelry she had purchased with my stolen corporate funds dug painfully into her skin as the highly trained agents forcefully overpowered her violent resistance. The cold, heavy steel of the handcuffs clicked sharply and definitively, locking tight around her slender wrists. The woman who had proudly engineered my total destruction, who had viewed my entire life as an expendable financial resource, was physically pinned against the polished marble wall, hyperventilating and completely stripped of her immense power. Two federal agents firmly gripped Allison's upper arms, hauling her aggressively away from the marble wall and marching her directly toward the shattered glass doors of the grand ballroom. Her high heels scraped loudly and awkwardly across the floor as she was dragged unceremoniously through the ruined, opulent lobby. As she was forced directly past the podium where I stood perfectly still, Allison twisted her neck violently to face me. Her eyes burned with a venomous, unadulterated hatred, completely devoid of any human empathy or lingering regret. She spat vicious guttural curses at me, screaming that I was a dead man and that she would systematically destroy my company from inside her federal prison cell. She hurled every vile insult she could manifest, threatening my life and my professional legacy with the absolute desperation of a completely defeated predator. I did not flinch or offer a single syllable of verbal response to her furious, psychotic rambling. I looked down at the woman who had invaded my family, poisoned my only son, and attempted to erase my entire existence for sheer profit, and I felt absolutely nothing but a cold, hollow finality. I simply watched her go. As the tactical agent shoved her roughly through the broken glass doors and out into the flashing blue and red lights of the humid Texas night, I offered her a single polite, chilling nod of farewell. Her screaming voice faded entirely into the wailing federal sirens, permanently excising her from my reality. The grand ballroom finally fell into a heavy, suffocating silence. The flashing federal lights painted harsh, rhythmic shadows across the ruined catering tables, the shattered champagne glasses, and the discarded remnants of Jared's completely demolished real estate empire. The agents systematically processed the remaining physical evidence and escorted my weeping son out the side entrance, marking the absolute end of the extortion scheme. The immediate physical threat had been permanently neutralized, but the complex financial shockwave of the evening was only just beginning to crest. I stood alone in the center of the silent venue, smoothing the lapels of my charcoal suit and mentally preparing to coordinate the massive legal cleanup awaiting my logistics firm back in Georgia. Before I could even turn toward the primary exit, the sharp, buzzing vibration of my private cell phone cut through the quiet room. I pulled the device from my pocket, recognizing Bradley's encrypted direct line. My attorney had slipped out the back doors during the initial federal breach to manually manage the external security perimeter. I answered the call, expecting a standard status report on the fleeing syndicate enforcers. Instead, Bradley spoke with a tight, strained urgency, warning me not to step outside the building under any circumstances. The remaining wealthy Texas investors, the powerful commercial developers, and the highly connected regional politicians had not fled to their safe suburban homes. They had aggressively gathered in the sprawling parking lot, completely blocking the main exits with their imported luxury vehicles. They had correctly deduced that my multi-million-dollar logistics company possessed the ultimate liquidity required to cover their staggering personal losses. They were absolutely furious and actively demanding immediate full financial compensation from my corporation for the massive scam my son had perpetrated against them. The crisis had simply evolved into a completely different kind of war. I pocketed my phone and walked deliberately through the shattered remnants of the grand ballroom doors, stepping over the sparkling fragments of glass that littered the luxurious foyer. The heavy, humid air of the Texas night hit my face the moment I crossed the threshold, completely replacing the chilled artificial atmosphere of the gala. The sprawling valet parking lot was a scene of absolute, unadulterated chaos. Dozens of high-end, imported luxury vehicles were parked at aggressive, haphazard angles, entirely barricading the primary exit routes and trapping everyone on the property. A massive swarm of furious wealthy investors, regional politicians, and aggressive commercial developers had congregated near the central fountain. They were shouting violently over the rhythmic wailing of the distant federal sirens, their faces flushed with rage and financial panic. Bradley was standing near the edge of the fountain, attempting to maintain a professional perimeter, but the sheer volume of the hostile crowd was overwhelming. The second the mob spotted my charcoal suit emerging from the shadows of the building, they surged forward like a pack of starving wolves. They completely surrounded me, shouting vicious legal threats and promising to launch massive class action lawsuits that would systematically dismantle my entire logistics empire in Georgia. They aggressively pointed their fingers inches from my chest, screaming that because Jared had illegally leveraged my corporate banking infrastructure to artificially back his fraudulent real estate syndicate, they were holding me entirely financially responsible for their catastrophic personal losses. The sheer volume of their collective rage was deafening, a physical wall of hostility designed to intimidate and overwhelm. They wanted blood, and they fully intended to drain my legitimate company dry to replace the millions they had foolishly handed over to a charismatic con artist. I did not take a single step backward, nor did I raise my hands in a defensive posture to appease their aggressive posturing. I simply stood my ground, planting my feet firmly onto the concrete, and tapped into 40 years of brutal, relentless commercial survival. I had navigated bloodthirsty corporate boardrooms, ruthless union strikes, and hostile corporate takeovers long before these pampered elite had ever signed their first investment portfolio. I locked eyes with the loudest and most aggressive developer in the front of the pack and unleashed a voice completely stripped of emotion or sympathy. I commanded the immediate, absolute silence of the crowd, projecting a cold, gritty authority that sliced directly through their hysterical shouting. The wealthy Texans faltered their aggressive momentum, breaking against my unyielding composure as a sudden tense quiet fell over the humid parking lot. I looked across the sea of angry faces and explicitly informed them that I would offer absolutely zero apologies for the criminal actions of a grown man who had independently chosen to orchestrate a federal extortion scheme. I stated clearly that Jared's monumental failures belonged entirely to him, and any frivolous lawsuit they attempted to file against my Georgia headquarters would be violently crushed in federal court by my elite legal team before it ever reached a judge. I let the harsh reality of my absolute legal immunity sink into their panicked minds, watching the remaining false bravado drain from their postures. However, I did not let them steep in their financial despair. I smoothly shifted my tone from defensive hostility to cold, calculating commerce. I informed the captive audience that while I owed them absolutely nothing, I possessed a singular, ruthless business proposition that would permanently solve our mutual problem. I pulled my lapels straight and clearly outlined a completely transparent, legally binding buyout strategy right there under the flickering yellow streetlights of the crowded parking lot. I explained that my Georgia-based logistics empire had been actively seeking a centralized operational hub to dominate the southern commercial shipping routes for the last 3 years. I proposed a massive immediate integration plan where I would personally absorb the fraudulent commercial real estate infrastructure Jared had falsely constructed and legally convert it into a legitimate, heavily funded southern distribution headquarters for my company. I offered to entirely buy out their original fraudulent contracts utilizing my own heavily verified corporate liquidity to instantly reimburse every single dollar they had foolishly wired into my son's phantom accounts. Furthermore, I promised to attach a guaranteed moderate profit margin to their initial investments, completely transforming their catastrophic financial disaster into a highly lucrative commercial victory. I explicitly clarified that this aggressive corporate restructuring would require their immediate unanimous legal consent and the absolute cessation of any further hostile legal threats against my primary operations back home in Georgia. I offered them a golden parachute meticulously forged directly from the burning wreckage of Jared's criminal empire, ensuring they walked away entirely whole while I simultaneously secured a massive geographical expansion for my legitimate business legacy. It was an absolutely foolproof commercial strategy that cleanly eliminated the legal fallout while aggressively expanding my own corporate footprint. The suffocating tension currently strangling the parking lot vanished almost instantly, completely replaced by a surging wave of eager, enthusiastic agreement. The wealthy Texas investors recognized immediately that I was offering them a miraculous, flawless escape route from a completely guaranteed financial slaughter. They aggressively pushed forward to shake my hand, rapidly pulling business cards from their tailored jackets and loudly pledging their total, unwavering support for my sudden commercial expansion into their territory. Within 10 minutes, I had successfully transformed a chaotic, catastrophic disaster zone into an incredibly profitable, heavily backed regional headquarters for my logistics firm. The angry mob morphed seamlessly into a group of relieved, smiling business partners actively clearing their luxury vehicles from the barricaded exits. I stood quietly watching the taillights fade into the dark, humid night, feeling a profound sense of absolute operational victory. However, the momentary calm was abruptly shattered when Bradley walked slowly toward me across the empty asphalt. The sharp, confident aura he had projected during the ballroom confrontation was completely gone, replaced by a grim, heavy shadow of absolute seriousness. He stopped a few feet away, keeping his voice extremely low as he delivered the final piece of news for the evening. He informed me that the federal tactical units had successfully processed Jared and temporarily booked him into the downtown county holding facility while he officially awaited a high-security federal transfer. Bradley looked me directly in the eye and explicitly stated that my son had been granted his mandatory single phone call from the cold holding cell. Jared had not called a high-priced defense attorney or a local bail bondsman. He had bypassed the legal channels entirely and formally demanded a final private face-to-face meeting with me. The heavy steel doors of the downtown county holding facility slammed shut behind me, sealing away the humid Texas night and replacing it with a sterile, suffocating chill. I sat perfectly still at the center of a scratched stainless steel visitation table. The room was entirely devoid of color or warmth, illuminated only by harsh, buzzing fluorescent tubes that cast long, brutal shadows against the cinder-block walls. The stark, desolate environment stood in absolute stark contrast to the sickeningly opulent ballroom Jared had occupied just hours earlier. I did not look at my watch or adjust my tailored charcoal suit. I simply waited in the heavy silence, fully prepared to permanently sever the final rotting tie to my past. The heavy, reinforced door on the opposite side of the room groaned loudly as a corrections officer keyed the electronic lock. Jared shuffled slowly into the visitation room. The physical transformation was staggering. He had been completely stripped of his custom-tailored silk tuxedo, his expensive imported shoes, and the sickeningly arrogant posture he used to dominate his wealthy victims. He was now wearing a stiff, faded orange standard-issue jumpsuit that hung loosely off his trembling frame. His perfectly styled hair was a chaotic mess, and the color had entirely drained from his face, leaving him looking pale, hollow, and utterly defeated. The heavy chains secured around his wrists clinked sharply against the metal table as he awkwardly pulled out the bolted steel chair and sat across from me. He looked absolutely pathetic. He was no longer a visionary real estate tycoon or a charismatic high society elite. He was simply a cornered, desperate criminal who had finally run out of shadows to hide in. I looked at the broken man sitting across the table and felt absolutely zero sympathy. Jared stared down at his chained hands for a long, agonizing moment before finally lifting his red, swollen eyes to meet my unwavering gaze. He immediately launched into a frantic, desperate barrage of pathetic pleading. His voice cracked and trembled as he begged me to post his federal bail, demanding that I tap into my corporate liquidity one last time to secure his release before the high-security prison transfer. He babbled uncontrollably, promising that he would completely change his life if I just wrote the check. He offered to return to Georgia with me, to surrender his fraudulent ambitions, and start completely over at the absolute bottom. He swore he would happily sweep the concrete floors of my logistics warehouses, load the freight trucks in the freezing rain, and do absolutely whatever it took to earn back my respect. He desperately attempted to leverage a fabricated sense of historical nostalgia. He brought up fishing trips from 20 years ago, Sunday dinners we used to share, and the childhood bicycles I used to repair for him in the garage. He was actively trying to weaponize my own paternal memories, desperately trying to resurrect the ghost of a loving father-son relationship he had personally and systematically murdered. He cried openly, letting tears stream down his pale face, insisting that we could drop the federal charges, handle the restitution privately, and simply go back to being a real family. He looked at me with a sickeningly fake expression of pure, innocent hope, entirely refusing to acknowledge the monumental scope of his federal extortion conspiracy. He honestly believed that after attempting to declare me mentally incompetent and stealing millions, he could simply wipe the slate clean by invoking the memory of a little boy who no longer existed. I let his pathetic weeping echo through the sterile cinderblock room until he simply ran out of breath. I leaned slightly forward, resting my forearms on the cold steel table, and delivered my response with a quiet, unyielding finality that offered absolutely zero room for negotiation. I explicitly informed Jared that he had completely forgotten the fundamental difference between a son and a parasite. A son respects the foundation built by his father, while a parasite merely drains the host until there is absolutely nothing left but a dry, rotting husk. I methodically laid out the absolute truth of his situation. I told him that I did not see a misguided child sitting across the table from me. I saw a ruthless, calculating adult who had actively chosen to forge medical documents, hire criminal syndicates, and illegally clone my private corporate networks to fund his own superficial vanity. I stated with absolute crystalline clarity that his monumental greed had fundamentally destroyed the only source of pure, unconditional love he had ever possessed in this world. I systematically dismantled his delusional hope, assuring him that there would be no bail check, no quiet restitution, and absolutely no return to Georgia. I told him that the family he was frantically trying to invoke had been permanently incinerated the exact second he decided my life was an expendable financial resource. He had made his choices with a perfectly clear mind, and now he was going to endure the brutal federal consequences entirely alone. Jared's mouth fell open in absolute silent horror as the crushing reality of my rejection finally penetrated his thick, arrogant skull. The frantic, hopeful light in his eyes instantly died, completely replaced by the dark, suffocating terror of his impending federal incarceration. I pushed my chair back, scraping it loudly against the concrete floor, and stood up to my full height, towering over the broken man chained to the visitation table. I maintained strict, unbroken eye contact as I reached slowly and deliberately into the breast pocket of my tailored charcoal suit jacket. I bypassed my heavy corporate checkbook and my platinum credit cards, bypassing every single tool of financial salvation he so desperately craved. Instead, I withdrew a single crisp, heavily creased $1 bill. I held the green paper tightly between my fingers, letting him stare at it under the buzzing fluorescent lights before I slowly slid it across the cold stainless steel table. I stopped pushing the bill the exact second it touched the edge of his chained hands. I looked down at him and stated with absolute, chilling precision that he was looking at his total and final inheritance. I officially informed him that my legal team had already formally excised his name from my corporate trusts, my private accounts, and my last will and testament. I turned my back on him completely and walked deliberately toward the heavy, reinforced exit door, signaling the corrections officer to end the visitation. Jared snapped out of his paralyzed silence and began violently pulling at his heavy chains. He slammed his fists against the metal table, screaming my name at the top of his lungs. His voice cracked into a hoarse, frantic wail, echoing endlessly off the sterile walls as the heavy steel door slammed definitively shut behind me, locking him away forever. The chartered flight back to Georgia was remarkably smooth, a quiet journey through the dark night sky that starkly contrasted with the absolute chaos I had just left behind in Texas. I sat in the wide leather seat of the private jet, sipping a glass of iced water and watching the sprawling city lights fade into absolute black nothingness below. When the heavy tires finally touched down on the familiar tarmac of my home state, I felt a profound sense of closure permanently settle over my shoulders. Dennis was already waiting with the primary vehicle, and we drove the familiar, darkened route back to the sprawling estate I had built over 40 decades of relentless, grinding labor. I unlocked the heavy oak front doors and stepped into the grand foyer. The massive house was completely silent. It was the exact same silence that had greeted me a week ago, but the underlying texture of the quiet had fundamentally changed. Before, it had been a comfortable, earned peace. Now the air felt incredibly heavy and suffocatingly thick. Every polished surface and shadowed corner seemed to actively echo with the lingering memories of the monumental betrayal that had been planned under my own roof. I walked slowly through the massive corridors, feeling the toxic resonance of Jared and Allison's deceit actively contaminating the space. I passed the grand dining room where they had smiled and shared my food while actively coordinating my federal ruin. I stood at the base of the grand staircase looking up toward the guest wing they had occupied during their visits. The physical structure of the estate remained entirely intact, but the emotional foundation had been permanently poisoned by their presence. The faint, lingering scent of Allison's expensive perfume and the ghostly echo of Jared's arrogant laughter seemed to actively mock the decades of hard labor that had paid for the very walls surrounding me. I could not simply continue living in a silent museum dedicated to a family that had actively tried to destroy me. The silence was no longer peaceful. It was a loud, constant reminder of the parasite I had unknowingly harbored. The very next morning, I initiated a total and uncompromising physical purge of the entire property. I did not waste a single second packing cardboard boxes or sorting through sentimental items. I hired an elite private demolition crew and instructed them to completely gut the entire east wing of the estate where Jared and Allison had stayed. I stood in the hallway and watched with absolute cold satisfaction as the workers aggressively swung heavy sledgehammers through the drywall, manually dismantling the physical space my son had occupied. The crew worked with ruthless efficiency, dragging heavy, industrial trash bins directly into the pristine bedrooms. I explicitly ordered them to throw out every single piece of imported Italian furniture, every thread of designer clothing left in the closets, and every high-end electronic device purchased with my stolen corporate funds. The massive mahogany bed frame was splintered into jagged pieces and hauled away. The expensive silk draperies were ripped aggressively from the windows and tossed into the growing pile of refuse. I systematically removed every single physical trace of their existence from my property. I did not donate the items or attempt to sell them to recover the costs. The items were fundamentally corrupted by the immense greed that purchased them, and I wanted them entirely destroyed. The workers cleared out the lavish bathroom fixtures, smashed the custom vanity mirrors, and stripped the imported hardwood floors down to the bare concrete foundation. I demanded that the very drywall be torn away, exposing the raw wooden studs of the house. I spent 3 entire days overseeing the systematic eradication of my son's footprint within my home. I watched the heavy dump trucks roll out of the iron gates, carrying away the shattered remnants of Jared's unearned luxury. As the final truck disappeared down the long driveway, leaving behind nothing but an empty, hollowed-out shell of a wing, I felt the suffocating weight finally lift from the corridors. The house was entirely physically and emotionally cleansed of their toxic infection. With the estate thoroughly cleansed and the structural renovations actively underway, I found myself filled with a massive, surging wave of renewed operational purpose. I possessed a staggering amount of corporate liquidity, heavily amplified by the incredibly lucrative buyout strategy I had successfully negotiated with the terrified Texas investors. I decided instantly that this newly acquired wealth would never be hoarded or wasted on ungrateful, entitled bloodlines. I completely restructured the primary mission of my logistics empire. I established a massive, heavily funded mentorship and commercial grant program specifically designed to identify and elevate young, disadvantaged African-American entrepreneurs. I funneled the massive profits from the Texas expansion directly into securing commercial leases, purchasing heavy freight equipment, and providing elite operational training for brilliant, hungry individuals who possessed absolutely zero capital but possessed an undeniable, relentless work ethic. I actively sought out the exact kind of gritty, desperate ambition that had fueled my own rise 40 years ago. I refused to hand my legacy over to a parasite, but I was more than willing to pass my vast corporate knowledge down to those who truly respected the daily brutal grind. I transformed my personal tragedy into a monumental launchpad for an entirely new generation of business leaders, ensuring my empire would actively empower my community rather than passively fund a fraudulent vanity project. Exactly 6 months after the federal raid in Texas, I stepped out onto my newly renovated back porch. The crisp morning air was incredibly sharp and clean, sweeping across the sprawling, perfectly manicured grounds of my estate. I held a steaming mug of black coffee in my hand, leaning comfortably against the heavy wooden railing and watching the vibrant orange sunrise slowly illuminate the horizon. My logistics empire was currently operating at peak unprecedented efficiency, and my new mentorship program was actively launching 3 highly successful regional startups. My life was entirely peaceful, structurally secure, and completely devoid of toxic manipulation. The heavy crunch of tires on the gravel driveway broke the morning quiet as a private courier pulled up to the front gate. Dennis walked out to intercept the delivery, returning a few moments later with a thick stack of corporate mail and legal documents. He set the stack quietly on the patio table and respectfully stepped away. I sorted through the commercial contracts and operational reports until I reached a heavily stamped envelope resting at the very bottom. The return address indicated a high-security federal penitentiary located out of state. I looked down at the desperate, frantic handwriting frantically scrawled across the front of the paper, immediately recognizing Jared's distinct, messy script. I stood perfectly still, staring at the letter from the federal inmate who used to be my son. I did not feel a single solitary drop of curiosity, regret, or lingering paternal obligation. I did not hesitate or debate opening the seal. I simply turned around and walked deliberately toward the blazing stone fire pit roaring on the edge of the patio. I dropped the unopened letter directly into the center of the white-hot flames. I watched the cheap paper instantly curl black and turn completely to ash, consumed entirely by the heat. The silent adjustment was absolutely complete. The silence surrounding me was incredibly profound, entirely beautiful, and for the first time in my life, completely my own. True wealth is never measured by the bloodline that inherits it, but by the character of those who build and sustain it. We often make the fatal mistake of confusing biological connection with genuine loyalty, pouring our hardest sacrifices into empty vessels. When a parasite disguised as family drains your life, cutting them off is not cruelty. It is fundamental survival. Generosity without boundaries breeds fatal entitlement. True legacy means redirecting your strength toward those who respect the grind, honoring your own dignity above toxic obligations. Real peace arrives the exact moment you let the destructive past burn away completely. If this story resonated with you, please subscribe to the channel, leave a comment below about how you would handle this level of betrayal, and share this video with someone who needs to hear this message today.